Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into God of Fiction, presenting to you today, what if the Goblin Nation declared war on the Ministry for poisoning Harry's magical core? Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1, The Audit. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Harry noticed it because it was different from the usual post. No ministry seal, no Hogwarts crest, no scrawling from Ron asking if he wanted to come watch the Chudley Cannons lose again. This envelope was made of material that wasn't quite parchment, something darker and smoother, almost like pressed leather, and it smelled faintly of copper and stone. The wax seal was deep red, pressed with the Gringotts double G emblem, and beneath that, in script so precise it looked machine-made, were the words, "By order of the War Chief's office. Attendance mandatory." Harry set down his coffee and read it twice. He'd been living in Grimmauld Place for 8 months now, which was 7 months longer than he'd intended. The plan after the war had been simple: find a flat, start Auror training, figure out the rest as he went. But the house had needed cleaning, and then it had needed clearing of dark objects, and then somehow it had started feeling less like a prison and more like somewhere he actually wanted to be, so he'd stayed. He'd repainted the hallway. He'd ripped out the portrait of Walburga Black after a particularly ugly screaming match at 2 in the morning. He'd learned to cook 3 things reasonably well. He'd been, by his own admission, genuinely fine. The letter changed the temperature of the room. Mr. Harry James Potter, Lord Potterblack, as pertains to matters of estate and covenant, you are hereby summoned to Gringotts Bank, London, on the morning of the 14th, to attend a formal inheritance audit as required by the Potterblack Vault Compact of 1823. This audit has been pending since the resolution of hostilities in the Wizarding Conflict of 1998 and may no longer be delayed under Section 7 of the Goblin Banking Covenant. Attendance is not optional. Failure to appear will be treated as abandonment of claim. Harry turned the letter over, as if the back might offer some kind of explanation. It didn't. He owed Hermione. She arrived 40 minutes later with a bag over her shoulder and flour on her robes, which meant he'd interrupted her baking, which meant she'd been stress baking, which meant she already knew something was wrong. She read the letter standing in his kitchen, lips moving slightly, and when she finished she set it on the table with the careful precision of someone buying time to choose their words. "You knew about this?" Harry asked. "I knew inheritance audits were standard after a significant war death toll." She sat down, reached for his coffee, drank half of it without asking. He didn't mind. "I didn't know yours had been pending for 8 months. Is that normal?" "No." She turned the letter over herself, doing the same thing he'd done. "Gringotts doesn't delay these. If they've been sitting on it for 8 months, it means they were building a case for something before they contacted you." Harry looked at her. "A case for what?" "I don't know." She handed the letter back. "But Harry, War Chief's office. These letters usually come from the Estate Department. The War Chief's office handles treaty violations. Criminal matters." She paused. "Serious criminal matters. Against me?" "I don't think so." She was quiet for a moment. "Against someone else. Possibly on your behalf." He went on the 14th. Diagon Alley was quieter than it used to be, still rebuilding in the small ways that took longer than patching stone, the confidence of shopkeepers, the easy laughter of people browsing, the complete absence of anyone looking over their shoulder. Some of it was back. Some of it wasn't. Harry walked the length of it with his hood down and his hands in his pockets, and the people who recognized him mostly nodded or smiled or looked away politely, and that suited him fine. He was done with the version of fame that required him to perform gratitude in public. He was cordial. He kept walking. Gringotts looked exactly as it always had, imperious and pale against the cobblestones, the long marble steps worn smooth by 10 centuries of feet, the bronze doors gleaming. 2 goblins flanked the entrance, and Harry noticed immediately that they weren't the usual ceremonial guards. These ones wore armor. Not decorative armor. Real armor, dark alloy plates fitted over leather, short-bladed weapons at their hips, eyes that tracked him from the moment he turned onto the steps. One of them stepped forward as Harry reached the top. "Harry Potter?" "Yes." "You'll follow me." "Not please follow me." "Not this way, sir." Just the flat expectation of compliance, which Harry found he didn't resent at all. He followed. They didn't take him through the main banking hall with its rows of counters and its echoing ceiling. Instead, the goblin led him through a side door Harry had never used, down a corridor where the stone changed quality, older, rougher, darker, and the torches on the walls burned a different color, something between amber and green. The air tasted like deep earth and old metal. They descended one staircase, then another, and Harry had the distinct sensation of moving into a part of the building that existed on entirely different terms than the one tourists saw. The room they arrived at was large and low-ceilinged, carved from a single piece of black rock. The table in the center could have seated 30. Today it seated 7 goblins, all of them in formal dress, dark robes with elaborate shoulder fastenings, faces carrying the particular expression of people who have been waiting and have not enjoyed the wait. At the head of the table sat a goblin Harry had never seen before. He was older than the others, that much was clear, not in any soft or diminished sense but in the way that old weapons are more dangerous than new ones because they've been tested. His face was a geography of sharp angles and deliberate stillness. His eyes were the color of old bronze, not brown, not gold, something between, and they fixed on Harry with an attention that felt almost physical. "Lord Potter Black," the goblin said. His voice was deep and precise, each word placed like a stone in a wall. "I am Ragnarok, war chief of the Goblin Nation." "Sit down." Harry sat. Ragnarok didn't waste time on pleasantries, which Harry appreciated. He gestured to the goblin on his left, who opened a leather folder and produced a document that was several pages long, covered in the cramped, angular script of goblin accounting. "Your inheritance audit began as routine," Ragnarok said. "A review of the Potter and Black Vault holdings, the assessment of magical contracts, property claims, dormant accounts. Standard procedure following a death-significant event." He paused. "It did not remain routine." "What did you find?" Harry asked. Ragnarok looked at him for a moment, not with hostility, but with something that might have been appraisal. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if Harry had passed some test Harry hadn't known he was taking. "We found evidence of a long-term magical assault on your person," Ragnarok said. "Specifically, on your magical core." The room was very quiet. Harry heard his own breathing. He heard the distant, mechanical grinding of the carts somewhere far below. He kept his face still because something in him had gone very cold and very focused in the space between one word and the next. "Show me," he said. The document came across the table. Harry looked at it and understood approximately a third of the goblin notation, which was a third more than he'd been able to read 6 months ago. He'd been studying, quietly, without telling anyone, but the healer's annotations were illustrated, and those he could read clearly enough. The diagrams showed a magical core. He knew what those looked like from Hermione's books, a dense, burning center from which magic flowed outward in channels the way a river split into tributaries. This one had something wrong with it. The channels were narrowed. Not uniformly, not by natural variation or trauma, but in a pattern, a deliberate, intricate, structured pattern that bore the unmistakable signature of sustained magical interference over years. "How long?" Harry asked. "Based on the scarring patterns, the interference began when you were 11. A goblin 2 seats down from Ragnarok spoke now, smaller, quicker looking, with ink stains on his fingers that suggested a life spent in records rather than armories. "It was designed to be cumulative. Self-reinforcing. Each year of exposure compounded the effect of the previous year." "What was the vector?" The ink-stained goblin blinked at him, apparently surprised by the precision of the question. "Multiple," Ragnarok answered. "The primary vector was food. Specifically, the dietary supply of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, compounds added to the Great Hall meals that were precisely calibrated to affect the developing magical cores of children without triggering detection wards. A secondary vector was identified in the ink composition of Hogwarts correspondence during your tenure. He paused. A tertiary vector was woven into the environmental wards of your dormitory in Gryffindor Tower. Harry put the document down. Not because he didn't want to look at it anymore, but because he wanted to be very precise and deliberate about what he said next. This was targeted at me specifically, he asked. Not every student. The food compounds would have had mild effects on the general population, Ragnarok said. Developing cores are resilient. For most students, the impact would have been within statistical noise, slightly reduced core capacity, attributed to diet, genetics, stress. Nothing actionable. He met Harry's eyes. But you were different. Your core was already unusual, exceptionally high innate capacity, even for a Potter, and the Potters have always run strong. For a core of your natural caliber, the compounds were not mild interference. They were systematic suppression. How suppressed? Harry's voice was very level. Ragnarok glanced at the healer's reports. Our best estimate, accounting for the natural development trajectory of a core of your baseline classification, is that you have been operating at approximately 32% of your natural magical capacity. 32%. Harry sat with that number for a long moment. He turned it over the way you turn over a stone to see what lived under it, and what he found there wasn't rage, not yet, it was something colder and more structural, the sensation of a foundational story being rewritten one word at a time. He thought about third year, working himself half to death over a Patronus, needing weeks to get it right. He thought about the graveyard, how it had felt like wringing water from stone, every spell an act of brute physical will. He thought about every time a teacher had said talented but unfocused, every time he'd had to fight twice as hard as it looked like he should have needed to. He thought about the Department of Mysteries, about the Ministry Atrium, about the forest, about all the moments where something inside him had surged past its boundaries only to slam back again like a wave against rock. He'd thought that was him. He'd thought that was his limit. Who? He asked. That, Ragnarok said, is why you are in this room and not at a standard audit counter. He folded his hands on the table. The gesture was almost human, but the stillness behind it wasn't. We have spent 8 months tracing the command architecture of this operation. We know the composition of the compounds used, the specific magical signatures on the dormitory wards, and the routing of purchase orders for the non-standard ink components used in Hogwarts correspondence. All paths lead to one originating source. He paused. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement. British Ministry of Magic. Specifically, the Sub-Office of Improper Use of Magic, during the tenure of Senior Undersecretary Dolores Jane Umbridge. Harry said nothing for a very long time. Outside, somewhere up above, London was going about its morning. Owls were being sorted. Tea was being made. The leaky cauldron was serving breakfast to witches and wizards who were reading the Prophet and arguing about Quidditch. The world was doing its ordinary thing, entirely unaware that in a room carved from black rock 100 feet below Diagon Alley, Harry Potter was learning that the institution which had put him on a pedestal for 20 years had spent 9 of those years trying to quietly make sure he could never climb higher than the pedestal allowed. Was this authorized at the ministerial level? He asked. Fudge signed 3 procurement orders that, when cross-referenced with our compound analysis, correspond to the primary food vector delivery system, Ragnarok said. Whether he knew precisely what he was signing is a question of intent, not of fact. The fact is his signature. And Dumbledore? The question tasted like something he didn't want in his mouth. Ragnarok was quiet for a moment that told Harry more than words would have. We have found no evidence of his direct involvement in the formulation or administration of the compounds, the war chief said carefully. What we have found is evidence that the wards used to anchor the dormitory interference were crafted using a magical signature consistent with extremely advanced transfiguration work, well beyond anything Umbridge or her department was capable of. Whether this means collaboration, subversion, or independent action by a third party has not been conclusively established. Harry absorbed that. Filed it. Kept his face still. What does this mean in terms of goblin law? He asked. You said the letter came from the war chief's office. Ragnar's expression shifted, not softening, nothing so gentle as that, but something that might have been the beginning of respect. You understand what that implies? I'm asking you to spell it out. Under the Goblin Banking Covenant, any client of Gringotts who suffers a deliberate magical assault of this nature is considered under the protection of the Goblin Nation, Ragnar said. You have been a Gringotts client since birth. Your family's relationship with this institution spans 6 centuries. He let that land. The attack on your magical core was not merely an attack on Harry Potter. Under our law, it constitutes an attack on a protected person of Gringotts. An attack on Gringotts itself. He paused. This is a declaration of cause. You're talking about war, Harry said. I am talking about the legal and martial right of the Goblin Nation to seek reparation for a deliberate assault on our institutional honor. Ragnar's voice didn't change. Whether that becomes war depends on how the ministry responds to what comes next. And what comes next? Ragnar looked at him, and something in those bronze eyes told Harry that this moment had been anticipated, prepared for, perhaps even hoped for, not with malice, but with the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time for the right person to be sitting in the right chair. We present our findings, Ragnar said. We demand accountability. We make clear the terms under which the Goblin Nation will consider this matter addressed. He paused. And we ask you, Lord Potterblack, what you want. What do you want? Nobody had ever asked him that in a room like this. Nobody official. Nobody with actual power. They'd told him what he was for, prophecy fodder, symbol, martyr, figurehead, but nobody had ever sat him down in a formal chamber and asked him to name his terms. I want the truth made public, Harry said. Not buried in a ministry inquiry where it gets redacted and filed away. Public. Every name, every document, every purchase order. I want the people who designed this held personally accountable under whatever law reaches them, wizarding or goblin, whichever has teeth. He paused. And I want my core healed. Ragnar nodded slowly. The healing is already arranged, pending your consent. Our senior healer is prepared to begin immediately. A pause. The rest, we are in complete agreement. Harry looked at him. You were going to do this whether I showed up or not. We were going to seek reparation under our own law whether you showed up or not, Ragnar confirmed. But your presence changes the nature of the action. This is no longer solely a matter of institutional grievance. Something moved in his expression, not warmth, exactly, but a kind of gravity. This becomes a matter of justice. And justice, Lord Potterblack, is a far more powerful instrument than war. Harry left Gringotts 2 hours later with a folder of documents under his arm, a healing appointment scheduled for the following morning, and the distinct, unsettling sensation of the ground shifting under him, not collapsing, nothing so catastrophic as that, but rearranging, recalibrating, every assumption he'd made about his own history settling into a different shape. He stood on the marble steps in the cold autumn air, the sounds of Diagon Alley moving around him, and he thought about Umbridge. Not the pantomime version that lived in the public memory, the toad face, the pink cardigan, the detentions. The real version. The one who had understood exactly what she was doing and had done it anyway, methodically, over 9 years, because she had looked at Harry Potter and decided that whatever he naturally was needed to be smaller. He felt something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite grief, something harder than both, something that had very clear edges. He walked back through Diagon Alley, and he didn't put his hood up. Hermione was waiting at Grimmauld Place with tea and a face that asked questions before her mouth did. He came through the door, sat down at the kitchen table, and told her everything. He watched her face change as he talked, the initial careful skepticism, the transition into something colder, the moment she stopped taking notes and just listened, and finally the moment he said 32% and saw her set her quill down entirely. She didn't say anything for a long time after he finished. "They have documentation," she said at last. It wasn't a question. 8 months of it. "And they're certain about the causal link between the compounds and your core suppression?" "That's an extraordinarily complex piece of forensic magical analysis, Harry, the kind that would require a level of Hermione." She stopped. "I know," she said quietly. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I know." She looked at the folder on the table between them but didn't reach for it. "Who else are you telling?" "Kingsley. Today." He paused. "I want him to have warning before Ragnarok sends the formal notification to the ministry." "Ragnarok is sending a formal notification?" "By end of the week, I think." Harry looked at her. "He gave me a few days." Hermione stared at him. "He's declaring war on the ministry." "He's reserving the right to, yes." "Harry," she stopped herself. He could see her doing it, see her physically setting aside whatever instinctive response had risen up, the one that defaulted to "this will cause chaos and think of the consequences and there must be another way." He loved her for setting it aside. "Okay," she said instead. "Kingsley. Today. I'll come. I was going to ask you to stay here and start cross-referencing the documents. Then I'll do that first." She pulled the folder toward her with the focused efficiency of someone who had never in her life been faced with a research task she didn't immediately take ownership of. "Go see Kingsley. Come back. We'll figure out what we're actually dealing with." He went to see Kingsley. The ministry atrium was a different place than it had been under Voldemort's reign, and different again from the Fudge era, and different even from the chaotic, shell-shocked place it had been immediately after the war. Kingsley had spent 8 months quietly dismantling the worst of its machinery. The blood status enforcement offices were gone, the Muggleborn Registration Commission had been formally dissolved, a number of portraits had been removed from prominent walls and were presumably having strongly worded conversations with ceilings in storage rooms. It was better. Genuinely, meaningfully better. Harry had never doubted that Kingsley would make it better. That made what he was about to do considerably more complicated. The minister's secretary showed him in without making him wait, which had always been the case since the war. Kingsley was at his desk in the way that powerful people with genuine work ethic occupied desks, not performing productivity, actually inside a problem, 2 documents side by side, a third in his hand. He looked up when Harry came in, and whatever he read on Harry's face made him put all 3 documents down. "Close the door," Kingsley said. Harry closed it. He sat down across the desk and opened the folder and pushed it across, and he watched Kingsley read. Kingsley Shacklebolt was not a man given to visible emotional display. Harry had watched him hold steady through things that would have unmade a lesser person. But as he worked through the audit documents, and he read them properly, every line, with the careful attention of a man who had once been a senior Auror and never lost the habit, something happened to his face. It was subtle. A tightening around the eyes. A stillness in the jaw. The controlled, professional expression of a man keeping something very large and very angry from reaching the surface. He read every page. When he finished, he closed the folder and placed both hands flat on it, as if applying pressure to something. "How long has Gringotts known?" he asked. 8 months. "They told no one in this building?" "They told me. This morning." Harry met his eyes. "They're sending you a formal notification by the end of the week. I'm here today because you deserve to know before the official version lands on your desk." Kingsley breathed slowly and evenly, and Harry could see him doing the political calculations, the domino fall of public exposure, the institutional fallout, the international implications of a Goblin War declaration, but he could also see Kingsley doing something else underneath all of that, something more fundamental and human. 32%, Kingsley said. "That's what the audit says." A long pause. "My God." Quietly. I have a healer appointment tomorrow morning. They think the damage is reversible. Most of it. Harry kept his voice neutral. What I need you to understand before the formal notification arrives is that Ragnarok is entirely prepared to invoke Goblin War rights under the Banking Covenant. He has the documentation to support it. What he does next depends on what this ministry does. I'll want to see everything. Kingsley tapped the folder. Everything you have. And I will need to move on this quickly, Harry. If Umbridge is still sitting on the Wizengamot when this goes public, she is, Harry said. I checked before I came here. Kingsley's jaw tightened. I'll have her suspended pending investigation before the week is out. With respect, Harry said quietly, she has been in the Wizengamot for 8 months since the war ended, in the building where you work, drawing on an institutional salary, while Gringotts has spent those 8 months proving she spent 9 years poisoning me. If it had been anyone else, I know, Kingsley said. He didn't make excuses. Harry respected him enough to let it sit without twisting the knife. I know. I'm not here to accuse you, Harry said. I'm here because I trust you, and I want this done right. But I need you to understand that Ragnarok is not posturing. If the ministry responds to his notification with delay or political deflection, he will invoke war rights. And given what I read in that audit today, I would not fight him on it. Kingsley looked at him carefully. Something moved in his expression, a reassessment, Harry thought. The look of someone recalibrating who they were talking to. You've changed. I've been living at 68% deficit for 20 years, Harry said. Imagine what I'm like at full capacity. He left the folder on Kingsley's desk and walked out, and he didn't look back. That evening, Grimmauld Place was lit up and slightly chaotic. Hermione had covered the kitchen table with documents, cross-referenced and color-coded with a system only she fully understood, and she'd apparently owed Neville at some point because he arrived at 6:30 with boots still dirty from the greenhouses and read the summary sheet Hermione had prepared with the same focused attention he'd once given to plant toxicology reports. Right, Neville said, when he finished. He set the paper down. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to need you to explain why you look calmer than I feel right now, because I am genuinely incandescent. I've had a full day to sit with it, Harry said. 32%, Neville said, and Harry recognized in his voice the same quality it had carried once in the corridors of Hogwarts under the Carrows, not hot anger, not theatrical fury, but the deep, structural outrage of someone with a very clear moral compass and an absolute intolerance for watching it be violated. You've been at 32% this whole time. Everything you did, the Triwizard Tournament, the Department of Mysteries, the Horcrux Hunt, the Battle of Hogwarts, you did all of that at 32%. Apparently. Harry. Neville looked at him with an expression that was almost physical in its directness. If you'd been at full capacity during any of those, I know. People died. His voice was very quiet. The kitchen was silent. Harry looked at the table covered in documents, at Hermione's careful annotations, at the audit report sitting at the center of it all like the stone that had broken the surface of a still pond. He thought about every moment of his life where he'd pushed against what felt like the ceiling of himself and found it exactly where they'd built it, not his ceiling, theirs, constructed carefully and maintained meticulously and designed to ensure he remained useful without becoming ungovernable. He thought about Dumbledore's hands on that dormitory ward. He thought about Fudge's signature on a procurement order. He thought about Umbridge in her cardigan, smiling her wide, rigid smile, going home every night having done what she believed was absolutely necessary. Tomorrow morning I start the healing process, he said. Ragnarok's formal declaration goes out by the end of the week. After that, he paused. After that, things are going to move quickly. We'll be there, Hermione said. Not are you sure, not should we reconsider, just the flat, unambiguous declaration of someone who has already made their decision. Neville nodded once. Outside, the London night pressed against the windows of number 12, and somewhere under Diagon Alley, in a room carved from black stone, Ragnox sat at the head of a long table and reviewed the final language of a formal notification that had been 2 centuries in the making, not just for this particular crime, but for the long slow accumulation of indignities and violations and broken covenants that this moment would finally, irrevocably, force into the light. He folded it with the care of someone handling something that was going to change the shape of the world. And in the house on Grimmauld Place, Harry Potter slept without nightmares for the first time in years, not because the world was safe, but because for the first time, he knew exactly what he was walking toward, and he wasn't walking away from it. Chapter 2, The Declaration. The healing room was underground. Harry hadn't expected that. He'd imagined something clinical and bright, the goblin equivalent of St. Mungo's white corridors and harried healers. Instead, Ragnox's aide had led him down through 3 levels of Gringotts he'd never seen, past vaults whose doors were covered in script that moved when you looked at it, through a corridor where the stone walls were warm to the touch, into a chamber that felt less like a medical facility and more like the inside of something alive. The walls were dark, smooth rock, and running through them in thin veins were streaks of something luminescent, not quite gold, not quite white, shifting like bioluminescence in deep water. The floor was covered in a material that felt like packed earth but absorbed sound. There were no sharp angles in the room. Everything curved. A wide, low platform occupied the center, covered in material that looked like woven metal but yielded like cloth when Harry sat on it. The healer's name was Thornfist, and she was ancient in the way that gave you no useful information about her actual age. She could have been 80 or 400, her face a dense topography of lines that suggested not deterioration but accumulation. She moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had never once in her life rushed a process and didn't intend to start now. She didn't ask how he felt. She didn't offer reassurance. She circled him twice, holding a device that looked like a tuning fork made from black iron, and when it resonated near his chest, the sound it made was wrong, muffled and fractured, like a bell someone had packed with cloth. "It is worse than the audit suggested," she said, in the flat, informative way of someone reading a weather report. "The primary suppression lattice has calcified. I expected early calcification. This is advanced." She looked at him. "You have been under tremendous magical stress for extended periods." "Most of my childhood, yes. That explains it." She didn't apologize on anyone's behalf, which Harry found oddly refreshing. "The lattice will need to be dissolved in stages. I cannot do it all today without causing damage of my own." "How many sessions?" 3. Possibly 4. She turned back to her instruments. "Today I remove the outermost layer. You will notice effects within hours. The full restoration will not be complete until the final session." She paused. "I should warn you, the process is not painful, but it is disorienting. Your body has operated under these constraints for so long that removing them produces a period of adjustment. You may feel very large, for a time." Harry looked at her. "Large. Your magic will not know its limits," she said simply. "Because for the first time, it will not have any artificially imposed ones. Until it calibrates to your natural state, it will tend to overflow." She picked up a second instrument, this one more elaborate, a series of interlocked rings that spun independently when she held it. "Try not to be alarmed." "I'm generally quite hard to alarm," Harry said. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite skepticism and not quite amusement. "We will see." She began. He didn't feel pain. Thornfist had been accurate about that. What he felt instead was pressure, deep, internal, structural pressure, like the loosening of something that had been wound very tight for a very long time. It moved through him in slow pulses, and he found himself thinking of the times at Hogwarts when the tension of living under Voldemort's shadow had lifted briefly, sitting by the lake, winning a Quidditch match, laughing genuinely at something Fred Weasley said, those small sudden moments of relief that had felt almost physical. This was like all of those at once, amplified enormously, moving through his chest and arms and the back of his skull in waves that weren't quite pleasure and weren't quite anything else he had a name for. And then something cracked. Not loudly. Not dramatically. A small, clean, internal fracture, like ice giving way in early spring, and through that fracture Harry felt something pour into the space it left, warm and immediate and enormous, the way a room suddenly makes sense when you open a window that's been painted shut for years. Every candle in the room ignited simultaneously. Thornfist didn't flinch. She took note of it, recording something in her cramped script, and continued. When she finished and stepped back, Harry sat on the edge of the platform and breathed carefully. The room felt different. Everything felt different. The veins of luminescence in the walls seemed brighter than they had when he came in, or maybe he was just seeing them more clearly, or maybe both things were true simultaneously. "How are you feeling?" Thornfist asked. It was the first time she'd asked. Harry considered. "Like I've been standing in a doorway without realizing it and someone just moved me into the room." She nodded. "That is accurate." She made another note. 2 days before the next session. Your core needs time to begin integrating the new capacity. She looked at him steadily. Do not engage in significant magical combat during this period. Harry thought about the week Ragnarok had outlined. Define significant. If you have to ask, she said, assume the answer is yes. He came back up through the levels of Gringotts feeling like the world had been turned up slightly, the way a film looks when someone adjusts the brightness, not different, exactly, just more. The sounds of the banking hall were crisper. The cold morning air outside was sharper. He stood on the marble steps for a moment, and without thinking about it, he reached for his magic the way he might flex a hand after a long period of keeping it still. It came immediately. It came like water from an open dam, not violent, but full and immediate and deep, and he pulled it back because he'd felt the edges of it reach toward the iron railings and the stone pillars and somewhere further than that. Right, he said quietly, to nobody. He'd been doing magic for 9 years while looking through a keyhole. Now the door was open, even just this first fraction of the way, and the difference was, he pressed his lips together and didn't finish the thought, because finishing it required him to do something with the rage that was sitting very quietly underneath everything, and he needed to stay focused. He walked to the leaky cauldron and drank a cup of tea and let himself feel ordinary for 45 minutes, and then he went home. Hermione looked up when he came in, took one look at his face, and said, something happened. The first session went well. He sat down. Apparently I lit every candle in the room. She stared at him. Simultaneously. And involuntarily. He looked at his hands. Hermione, I reached for my magic outside on the steps, just to check, and it almost grabbed the building. She was very quiet for a moment. What did it feel like? He thought about how to answer that honestly. Like finding out the river you've been swimming in your whole life was actually the ocean. The owl arrived at 1:30. It was a formal ministry bird, grey, official, carrying a sealed document with Kingsley's personal mark. Inside was a single page, tightly written, which Hermione read over Harry's shoulder. Umbridge suspended from Wisengamot duties pending formal review, effective this morning. She has been informed of the allegations. She did not react the way I expected. She was not alarmed. She was contemptuous. I thought you should know that. K.S. Harry read the last 3 sentences twice. She was not alarmed. She was contemptuous. He set the letter on the table. She doesn't think it'll stick, he said. She has allies in the Wisengamot, Hermione said quietly. She's been building them for years. Half those seats have held the same people through 4 administrations, Fudge, Scrimgeour, Thickness, Kingsley. They don't change with the government. She sat down. She thinks this is a Gringotts filing that Kingsley can be pressured into making go away. She hasn't seen the full audit. She doesn't need to. She knows what she did. She's calculating whether anyone can prove it in terms that bind her legally. Hermione's voice had the particular quality it got when she was furious and making herself stay analytical. Wizarding law on magical assault is complicated. The prosecution has to prove sustained intent as well as impact. Goblins have documentation, but goblin documentation isn't automatically admissible in Wiesengemot proceedings. Then it won't be a Wiesengemot proceeding, Harry said. That's Ragnarok's whole point. Right. She nodded. Right. Okay. He sent a reply to Kingsley, noted. Do not let her leave the country. The formal declaration arrived on Thursday. Not by owl. That was the first signal that this was operating on entirely different protocols than standard ministry correspondence. A goblin courier arrived at the Ministry of Magic's main entrance at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, armored, and presented a sealed document to the front desk with the instruction that it be delivered to the minister's office immediately. The courier then stood in the atrium and waited, because goblin law required that formal declarations be received in the presence of a witness from the issuing party. Harry knew all of this because Kingsley sent him a message the moment it happened, and Harry went. He arrived in the ministry atrium 20 minutes after the courier, and by then a small crowd had gathered, ministry workers, witches and wizards who'd been passing through, a few journalists who'd apparently had wind of something. The goblin courier stood in the center of the atrium with the absolute composure of someone who had been prepared to stand there all day if necessary. Harry walked past the crowd, past the security checkpoint, straight to where the courier stood. The courier looked at him. Lord Potter Black. Good morning. Harry said it simply, as an acknowledgement. Something moved in the courier's face, not surprise, but a kind of recognition. The war chief said you would come. He's right about most things, Harry said. He went upstairs to Kingsley's office, where the minister was sitting behind his desk with the declaration open in front of him and the look of a man doing very precise emotional management. Two of his senior advisors flanked him. One of them Harry recognized, Persephone Abernathy, the ministry's chief legal counsel, a sharp-faced woman in her 50s who had spent 30 years navigating institutional law and looked like every one of those years had been a fight she'd chosen to have. You've read it? Kingsley asked when Harry came in. I was briefed on the structure, not the final language. Harry sat down. How bad is it? Abernathy answered, because that was apparently her function today. The Goblin Nation has formally invoked Clause 11 of the 1792 Banking Covenant, which establishes that deliberate magical assault on a Gringotts protected person constitutes an institutional aggression against the Goblin Nation as a corporate entity. Her voice was precise and entirely without inflection, which told Harry she was genuinely concerned. Under Clause 11, the Goblin Nation is entitled to demand reparation, impose economic sanctions including the cessation of banking services, and in the event of non-compliance within a stated period, escalate to full martial action. What's the timeline? Harry asked. 30 days, Kingsley said. They want a formal acknowledgement of responsibility from the ministry, a criminal prosecution of the named individuals under both wizarding and goblin law, and, he looked down at the document. Full restoration of what they call the natural magical heritage of the protected person. Which means completing the healing. That last one's already in motion, Harry said. Kingsley looked at him. You've started? First session was yesterday. Harry paused. Ragnarok arranged it before sending the declaration. He wanted to be able to say it had already begun. He looked at the document. He's not posturing, Kingsley. Every element of this has been thought through. I know. Kingsley leaned back. The sanctions provision alone could cripple us. Every vault in Britain is held by Gringotts. Every financial instrument, every business account, every family trust. If they close the doors, he stopped. Then the ministry responds appropriately in 30 days, Harry said, and they don't close the doors. Abernathy turned toward Harry with the expression of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity and had just found it. Mr. Potter, there are legal complexities here that complicate a clean prosecution. The primary evidence is goblin-generated forensic documentation, which under the statute of judicial equivalence requires, I know, Harry said. Hermione explained it last night. Abernathy paused. Then you'll understand that even with the Ministry's full cooperation, building a case that satisfies wizarding evidentiary standards from Goblin audit materials is a challenge, Harry said, not an impossibility. And I'd suggest you frame it as the former rather than using it as a reason to tell Ragnarok the Ministry can't meet his terms. A silence. Abernathy looked at him with a reassessment very similar to the one Kingsley had done 2 days ago. No, she said, slowly, it is not an impossibility. Then I'd recommend starting there, Harry said pleasantly. The meeting ended with Kingsley committing to a formal Ministry response within 5 days, not 35, because he understood the optics of taking the full deadline, and Abernathy already making lists of things on a scroll that she rolled as she walked. Harry collected himself and went back down through the Ministry, and in the atrium the Goblin courier was gone, and in his place was something else, a copy of the Declaration, posted on the official Ministry notice board where the public could read it, because that was also part of Goblin law. Formal declarations were public documents. A cluster of people stood in front of it. Harry watched them reading it from across the atrium, watched the expressions change as they reached what was clearly the central paragraph, the specific nature of the offense, the targeted suppression of a magical core, the 9 years of systematic poisoning. He watched one woman put her hand over her mouth. He watched 2 men look at each other with something that wasn't quite disbelief because the Ministry had given people enough reasons not to be surprised by its worst behavior, but something close to it. He walked out. The Prophet had it by the afternoon edition. Hermione brought the paper to the kitchen table with the expression she wore when she wanted to discuss something difficult, which meant she'd already decided to discuss it regardless of whether Harry wanted to. He poured tea for both of them. The headline was, Goblins Declare War, Ministry Poisoned Potter's Magic for 9 years. The subheading, in slightly smaller letters, Umbridge named in Gringotts audit. Fudge signature found on procurement orders. Harry looked at it for a moment. Then he turned to the inside page where the actual reporting was. Rita Skeeter had the byline. Of course she did. He'd long since stopped being surprised by Rita's ability to materialize at any event with maximum consequence. She'd gotten the full text of the declaration, quoted extensively from the audit summary, and had managed, in her particular style, to make the story simultaneously more lurid and more accurate than anyone else's version. The facts were there, all of them, clearly presented, buried in prose that was more dramatic than necessary but not, he noted, actually wrong. The Goblin Nation has done what no wizarding court managed in 20 years, she'd written, which is hold the Ministry of Magic accountable for what it did to Harry Potter. The question now is not whether the Ministry is guilty, Gringotts has established that beyond any reasonable doubt, but whether Wizarding Britain has the courage to look at the answer. Harry folded the paper. Hermione, he said, do you remember 4th year? She blinked at the change of subject. What about it? Moody, Crouch Jr., was teaching us about the unforgivables. And I remember thinking that the Ministry couldn't be all bad, because Dumbledore was there and Kingsley was an Auror and there were good people in it. He looked at the folded paper. I kept thinking that. All the way through. Even when Fudge was trying to discredit me, even during 5th year, even under thickness, I kept holding on to the idea that the institution itself was basically sound and the bad people were aberrations. And now? Now I think the institution was designed to manage certain kinds of power. And manage is a polite word. He pushed the paper aside. I'm not saying Kingsley isn't good. I'm saying Kingsley is a good man inside a machine that kept my magic at 32% for 9 years and didn't notice, or didn't care, or didn't look. Hermione was quiet for a long moment. What are you going to do with that? Change the machine, he said simply. Neville arrived at 6 with Ron, which Harry hadn't expected. Ron came through the door looking like he'd been rushing, red in the face, hair messed, coat half-buttoned, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Tell me the Prophet didn't misprint something. Tell me that number is right." 32%, Harry said. Ron sat down heavily. He was quiet in a way Ron almost never was, not the comfortable quiet of someone at ease but the silence of someone rearranging themselves around something. Harry watched him and didn't try to fill it. The whole time, Ron said finally. The whole time we were at Hogwarts, at the Burrow, all of it, yes. You never, he stopped. Obviously you never knew. That's the point. He pressed his hands flat on the table. Harry, do you remember the last task? The maze? When you came out, Ron, you were unconscious for 2 days. And we were told it was magical exhaustion, that the task had been too much, that you'd overtaxed yourself. His voice was very controlled in a way that suggested the control was considerable effort. That was their explanation. You'd overtaxed yourself. Because you weren't, he pushed his hands through his hair. What are you going to do? Support the Goblin Declaration, Harry said. Stay visible. Make it impossible for the Ministry to bury this. He looked at his best friend. And get the rest of the healing done. Right. Ron nodded, several times, processing. Right. And Umbridge is suspended. She'll fight the prosecution. Ron's expression said something emphatic that he didn't translate into words. Then, what do you need from me? To not do anything that gives anyone an excuse to make this about something other than what it's about, Harry said, which they both understood perfectly as the specific instruction it was. Ron looked at him. Has anyone ever told you that you have very effective ways of telling people to calm down? Hermione told me that last Tuesday. The owl from Ragnarok arrived while they were eating. Hermione had made pasta, and there was bread, and the kitchen was warm and full in a way that felt almost aggressively normal given the content of the letter. It was brief. Harry read it and passed it to Hermione. The Ministry's initial public response is inadequate. Their representative described our declaration as a matter under review and a complex legal situation requiring careful consideration. This is a refusal dressed as caution. I have requested a direct meeting with the minister. I would prefer you attend. He wants you in the room, Hermione said. I know. Harry took the letter back. He's right. Ragnarok doesn't need you in that meeting, she said carefully, which was her way of asking if Harry had thought through what it meant to sit beside the war chief of the Goblin Nation in a formal confrontation with the Ministry. No, Harry agreed. He doesn't need me there. He wants me there because my being there changes what the meeting means. It stops being the Ministry dealing with a goblin grievance and becomes the Ministry facing both of us. He met her eyes. They spent 9 years trying to make sure I'd never be able to do something like that. I'm going to go sit in that room. The meeting was set for the following morning. Ragnarok arrived at the Ministry with 6 goblins, not a delegation, an escort, which was a meaningful distinction. All 6 wore the dark armor Harry had seen at the Gringotts entrance, the real kind, the kind with weight and purpose. They moved through the atrium in a formation that was impeccably courteous and absolutely unyielding, and the Ministry workers who saw them parted without being asked, because the Goblin Nation's formal escort protocols had been established in 1792 and everyone who worked in a building built on top of Goblin Dug foundations had a deep, instinctive awareness of what those protocols signified. Harry was already in the meeting room when they arrived. He'd come early, on purpose, and taken the seat on the right side of the table that was neither at the head nor at the Ministry's side, the seat that announced, geometrically, that he was not here as a Ministry representative. Ragnarok came in and saw him there, and something moved in those bronze eyes, something that might have been satisfaction. He took the seat beside Harry without comment. Kingsley came in with Abernathy and 2 other advisors. He looked at the seating arrangement and absorbed its implications without reacting. He sat at the head of the table, his room, his building, but Harry noticed he didn't take the chair directly and immediately, the way powerful people sometimes did to claim territorial priority. He sat down the way someone sits when they've already decided they're going to listen. Harry adjusted his assessment of Kingsley upward. War Chief Ragnarok, Kingsley said. Thank you for coming. I am here because the Ministry's public response to our declaration did not reflect the seriousness of the matter, Ragnarok said. He didn't add you're welcome, and Kingsley didn't expect it. We will discuss what an adequate response looks like. That is exactly what I want to discuss, Kingsley said. Then we begin. Ragnarok placed his hands flat on the table. The Goblin Nation has presented documentation of a deliberate, sustained, institutionally organized magical assault on a protected person. The documentation is comprehensive and has been reviewed by our senior forensic specialists over 8 months. It is not disputed. What is at issue is accountability. I am not here to dispute the findings, Kingsley said. I want to be clear about that. Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. Good. Just that. Then, the named individuals must face formal criminal proceedings under terms acceptable to the Goblin Nation. Not suspended pending review. Proceedings. A timeline we agree upon today. I can commit to charges being laid against Dolores Umbridge within 10 days, Kingsley said. The matter of former Minister Fudge is more complex. He is elderly and his mental capacity has declined significantly, declined conveniently, one of Ragnarok's aides said. Perhaps. Kingsley didn't flinch. I am telling you the legal reality, not making excuses for it. We will pursue it to the extent the law permits. On Umbridge, there will be no delay. The prosecution must include the charge of deliberate suppression of magical heritage, Ragnarok said. That specific charge. Not a general assault charge that the Wisingamot can address with a fine and a censure. I'll need to work with my legal team on the exact statutory language. Abernathy already knows how to frame it. Ragnarok looked at Abernathy, who had the expression of someone who'd been found out. Don't you? A pause. I've been reviewing precedents since Tuesday, she said. Ragnarok returned to Kingsley. Then it is a matter of will, not capacity. Yes, Kingsley said. It is. Something shifted in the room, a tension that had been structural, load-bearing, easing by a fraction. Harry had said nothing through this exchange, and he continued not to, because Ragnarok didn't need his voice here. What he needed was Harry's presence, Harry's body in the chair, the visible fact of Harry Potter sitting beside the war chief of the Goblin Nation in the Ministry of Magic's own meeting room, refusing to be managed from a safe distance. But then Abernathy said, carefully, there is the matter of evidence admissibility in Wisingamot proceedings, and something in her tone told Harry she was setting up to make the complexity of that an excuse for delay rather than a problem to be solved, and he found he had something to say after all. Hermione Granger has already drafted a motion to establish a joint evidentiary framework between Goblin Forensic Certification and Wizarding Judicial Standard, Harry said. She'll have it ready for your review today. It addresses the admissibility gap directly. He looked at Abernathy. If you'd like to work with her on refining it, I think you'd find the collaboration productive. Abernathy stared at him. Then at the folder she was holding. Then back at him. Already, last night, Harry said. She's thorough. The meeting went on for another hour, and when it ended, there were 3 agreed commitments written on ministry letterhead, charges against Umbridge within 10 days, a joint legal framework for evidence admissibility within the same period, and a formal ministerial acknowledgement of institutional responsibility for the events described in the audit, to be published within the week. Ragnarok signed his name to the document with a pen that was plainly a personal object, dark metal, old, with wear marks at the grip. He handed the pen to Harry without being asked. Harry signed his name as witness. Ragnarok looked at the signatures. Harry's, then his own, side by side on ministry paper. 2 more healing sessions, Ragnarok said. Not loudly, not for the room. Directly to Harry. I know, Harry said. When the 3rd is complete, the war chief said, come and see me. He paused. What you carry now is a fragment of what you should have always had. When the rest is returned, he stopped. The bronze eyes were direct and entirely without sentiment. I want to see it. Harry looked at him. Why? Because, Ragnarok said simply, the wizarding world has been afraid of what you might be for 20 years and went to considerable effort to ensure it never found out. He closed the folder. I am not afraid. And I think it is time someone was present who is not. Harry picked up his copy of the signed document and folded it into his coat pocket, and he didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything adequate to say. Outside the ministry, in the thin grey light of a London autumn, the city continued. The leaky cauldron had customers. Owls moved in arcs between buildings. A copy of the Afternoon Prophet was being read on a bench by the entrance to the Muggle tube station, the headline visible from 20 feet, Ministry meets with Ragnarok, Potter present. A wizard Harry didn't recognize looked up from the paper, saw him on the steps, and for a moment just looked. Not with the old reverence or the parasocial familiarity. With something different. Something that felt more like recognition. Like the look you give someone when you finally understand what they are. Harry walked past him and into the street, and the cold air felt entirely, completely like itself. Chapter 3, The Healer's Truth. The second session was 3 days after the first, and Harry went alone. He didn't tell Hermione the exact time. Not because he was hiding it, she knew the schedule, but because there was something about the process that felt private in a way he couldn't fully articulate, the way certain kinds of grief are private not because you're ashamed of them but because they belong specifically to you and the act of being witness changes them into something else. He walked to Gringotts in the early morning before Diagon Alley had properly woken up, when the shopkeepers were just rolling up their shutters and the cobblestones were wet from overnight rain. Thornfist was already in the healing room when the aide brought him down, instruments laid out in a careful row on a bench of dark stone. She had the quality of someone who had been present and ready long before their scheduled time, not out of eagerness but out of a fundamental professional standard that didn't recognize the concept of almost ready. She didn't greet him. She gestured at the platform. He sat. The first session will have already caused significant integration activity, she said, picking up the iron tuning fork. Your core has been working to fill the newly available space. This is normal. You may have experienced unusual magical sensitivity in the past few days. The world looked brighter, Harry said. I could hear things more clearly. And yesterday I was making tea and the kettle boiled about 40 seconds before it should have. Yes. She ran the tuning fork through the air near his sternum. The sound it made was already different from 3 days ago, less muffled, but ragged at the edges, like a sentence that had been corrected halfway through. Your core is actively trying to expand into the released space. But the second layer of the suppression lattice is still compressing the upper channels. Think of it as, she paused, which was unusual for her. You know what it is to breathe with a weight on your chest. I know what it is to have a piece of someone else's soul living in my head for 17 years, Harry said. I think I understand the metaphor. She looked at him for a moment with that unreadable expression that he was starting to interpret as something close to respect. This layer is more densely woven than the first. The calcification is older. It will take longer to dissolve and the integration will be more pronounced. Pronounced how? More candles, she said, which was about as close as she came to humor. She was right, as it turned out. The second layer came apart differently from the first. The first had released with that single clean fracture, a precise interior snapping that had been almost delicate. This one unraveled, slowly, in threads, each thread coming free with a sensation that moved outward from his center in concentric pulses. The luminescent veins in the walls brightened visibly. The candles didn't just ignite, they burned twice their normal height, the flames going still and vertical, not flickering at all, as if they'd been painted there. And then the windows. There were no windows, 3 levels underground, but the 2 decorative panels set into the far wall, which Harry had assumed were inlaid stone, turned out to be covered in something he'd taken for opaque mineral that was in fact translucent, and they lit up. Thornfist noted this in her ledger. Harry sat in the center of it and breathed. The sensation this time wasn't just the opening of a window feeling from the first session. This was structural. He could feel his magic differently, not as the familiar pressure behind the eyes that had always told him power was available, but as something three-dimensional, something with actual depth, like the difference between seeing a painting of a landscape and standing inside one. He could feel it occupying space that had been empty, filling channels that had been sealed off for so long they'd almost stopped registering as absent. He thought, very clearly and without drama, this is what I was supposed to feel like at 15. The thought sat in him with a weight that wasn't grief and wasn't anger, but borrowed something from both. When Thornfist stepped back, the room's elevated luminescence dimmed gradually, like a tide going out, but didn't return to its pre-session level. It stayed brighter than it had been when he'd walked in. She looked at the walls, then at her instruments, then at Harry, and made several notes. "You're further along than I projected," she said. "Is that good?" "It means the damage, while extensive, did not permanently compromise the fundamental structure of your core. The channels are scarred, but they are not destroyed." She set her ledger down. "Some cases of long-term core suppression result in permanent channel collapse. In those cases, we can remove the suppression, but there is nothing left to expand into." She looked at him directly. "That is not your situation." Harry absorbed this quietly. The version of this conversation where Thornfist had told him the damage was permanent had been sitting at the back of his mind since the first session, an unacknowledged possibility he'd been carrying without looking at directly. "Why not?" he asked. "If the suppression was that thorough for that long, because your core's natural capacity is extraordinary," she said. The word extraordinary in her flat, clinical voice was the equivalent of another person using a much larger word. It did not merely resist the suppression. It grew around it. Compensated. Used what it had available with exceptional efficiency while continuously trying to generate new pathways around the blocked ones. She paused. "Think of a river that has been dammed. Most rivers in that situation pool and stagnate. Some rivers cut new channels." She looked at him. "You spent 20 years cutting new channels." Harry thought about every creative spell solution under pressure. Every moment he'd found a way when all the obvious ways were shut. Every time he'd done something that made trained aurors look twice. "Third session when?" he asked. 4 days. She picked up her instruments. "Do not engage in significant magical combat, yes." He stood. "What counts as significant?" "Anything with intent to harm," she said. "Defensive magic, passive wards, standard utility spells, fine. The moment you engage with active combat intent, the integration process accelerates in ways I cannot fully control." She met his eyes. "You will not be hurt. But the environmental effects may be considerable." "Considerable like the windows lighting up?" "Considerably more considerable than that," she said. He went up through the levels of Gringotts with the world turned up another notch, the way it had been after the first session but more so, sounds arriving with precise clarity, textures registering more sharply, the magical signature of every ward and enchantment in the building standing out like lit windows in a dark street, visible where before he'd had to look for them. He stopped on a lower level for a moment and just felt the building. The density of enchantments layered over centuries. The bone-deep magic in the stone. The vaults humming with their individual protections far below. He felt where the wards were strong and where they had been repaired and where they were old enough that they'd settled into the architecture the way tree roots settle into soil. An aide who'd been waiting to escort him looked at him standing still in the corridor and said nothing, with the specific quality of goblin silence that meant they were observing carefully. "This building is extraordinary," Harry said. The aide said, "Yes." As if it were simply a fact. He walked out into Diagon Alley, and this time when he reached for his magic on the steps, he had to be more deliberate about the range, because the reach of it had extended without his asking, spreading out like a sense rather than a tool. He pulled it back carefully, like reeling in a line, and made a mental note to practice that, containment, calibration, learning the new edges. He'd been controlling his magic under suppression his entire life, which meant he was actually quite good at control. The difference now was that the thing he was controlling had gotten significantly larger. He could work with that. Hermione was at Grimmauld Place, as expected, but she wasn't alone. She was at the kitchen table with a woman Harry didn't recognize, late 40s, brown skin, sharp dark eyes behind narrow glasses, robes that were ministry-cut but not ministry-issued, which meant consultant rather than staff. She had a stack of parchment in front of her and the posture of someone who'd been in the middle of a complicated argument when he walked in. Hermione looked up. "How was it?" "Lit up the room," Harry said. He looked at the woman. "Hello. This is Delia Marcus," Hermione said. "She's a specialist in wizarding evidentiary law. She's been helping me finalize the joint framework motion." "The Granger-Marcus framework," Delia said, without looking up from her parchment. "I'm claiming co-authorship." "You added 2 paragraphs," Hermione said. "Very important paragraphs." "Hermione mentioned you," Harry said, which was not technically true but felt true in that he'd have expected this conversation to already be happening. Delia Marcus looked up at him properly for the first time. She had the direct gaze of someone who had spent her career in rooms where people tried to talk around the point and had developed a professional allergy to it. "You're the one who told Kingsley's legal team to work with her," she said. "I was on retainer with Abernathy. She called me the night of the ministry meeting." A pause. "Your name came up." "Positively, I hope." "She said you were alarmingly prepared." Delia's expression suggested she agreed. "She also said you had the seating arrangement at the meeting with Ragnarok do about half his diplomatic work for him." "Ragnarok's diplomatic work doesn't need any help," Harry said, sitting down and pouring himself tea from the pot on the table. "I just didn't want to sit on the ministry's side." "Smart." Delia went back to her parchment. "The framework is close. The main remaining issue is the chain of custody argument. Goblin forensic materials need a certification pathway that wizarding courts will accept without the evidence being re-examined entirely under wizarding protocols, because obviously re-examination means access, and the goblins will not give the ministry access to their forensic methodology," Harry finished. "Because then the ministry knows exactly how to avoid detection next time." Delia stared at him. Hermione didn't look up from her own parchment. "I told you he was like this." "You said he was cleverer than he let on in school," Delia said. "You didn't say he'd cut to the evidentiary theory in 30 seconds. "I had a lot of time to think on the walk over," Harry said. "The solution is a sealed certification process," Hermione said, setting down her quill. "A goblin-appointed certification officer verifies the chain of custody to the satisfaction of the goblin standard, and that officer's certified statement is what enters wizarding proceedings, not the underlying methodology. Same way Muggle expert witness testimony works. The court accepts the expert's conclusion without demanding access to every component of their analytical process." "That's the direction we're going," Delia confirmed. "Ragnarok will need to sign off on the certification officer designation." "I can bring it to him," Harry said. Both women looked at him. "He said to come see him after the second session," Harry said. "This gives me a reason." He picked up the relevant section of the draft. "Can I take this?" "It's a draft," Hermione warned. "I'm not submitting it to the Wizengamot." He folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat. Delia watched him do this. "You're very comfortable walking into Gringotts and telling the war chief of the Goblin Nation that you want him to review a legal draft?" Harry considered the question honestly. "He's direct, he respects directness, he respects preparation, and he finds political theater boring," he said. "As long as I show up with something actually worth his time, I'm fine." "Most people are terrified of him," Delia said. Harry stood. "Most people have never had the Goblin Nation formally declare war on their behalf," he said. "It changes the relationship." He went back to Gringotts. Ragnarok was in a different room this time, not the black stone meeting chamber but a working office higher in the building, close enough to the surface that Harry could hear the faint sounds of the banking hall overhead. The room was lined with shelves of ledgers and document boxes, all labeled in Goblin script, and there was a worktable spread with maps that Harry recognized, the British Isles, but with markings that indicated magical geography rather than Muggle, ley lines and enchantment territories and, Harry noticed, the precise location and ownership status of every significant piece of wizarding property in Britain. Ragnarok looked at the draft section Harry placed on the table, read it without picking it up, and said, "The certification officer needs to hold senior rank within the Forensic Covenant Division. Junior officers are insufficiently independent. Would you be willing to put that in writing as a counter-specification?" Harry asked. Ragnarok looked at him. "Sit down." Harry sat. Ragnarok rolled the maps on the table to one side and looked at Harry with the full attention quality that he brought to everything, that sense of someone for whom multitasking was a choice rather than a default. "How are you feeling?" "Larger," Harry said. "In a good way." Thornfist's report said the second lattice layer released fully. She was not expecting that until the third session. He paused. "You understand what that means for the final session?" "More pronounced integration." Harry looked at his hands. "She told me not to engage in combat." "You will not need to before the third session," Ragnarok said. "And after," he paused, and this was one of the first times Harry had seen him pause to find words rather than simply waiting before deploying ones he'd already chosen. "After the third session, combat will not be a concern." "Meaning I'll be able to handle it?" "Meaning," Ragnarok said precisely, "that the nature of the concern will be different. You will not be worrying about whether you can handle it." He looked at Harry with those bronze eyes that evaluated everything. "Has anyone tested your magical output since the sessions began?" "No." "Would you object if I arranged that?" "Informally." He gestured, indicating that the offer was not connected to anything official. Harry thought about Thornfist's warning. "Not today." She was firm about the integration window. "After the third session, then." It wasn't exactly a question. Ragnarok moved on in the way of someone who has marked something for later. "The prosecution timeline, Kingsley has committed to 10 days. Has something changed?" "Nothing has changed. I am monitoring it." He looked at the maps. "Umbridge has retained Barnabas Cuff as her legal representative." Harry thought for a moment. "The former editor of the Prophet?" "Retired editor. He has been in private practice for 3 years. He is highly skilled at media management and jury perception." Ragnarok said this without apparent judgment, as a piece of strategic information. "He will attempt to reframe the prosecution as a political action, the ministry, under pressure from an aggressive Goblin declaration, sacrificing a long-serving ministry official to satisfy a non-wizarding power." "That narrative works if I stay in the background," Harry said. "Yes." Ragnarok folded his hands. "It does not work if you are visible and vocal. Cuff cannot frame you as a ministry concession to Goblin pressure if you are independently and vocally demanding accountability." He looked at Harry. "You understand I am not asking you to perform anything." "I know." Harry met his eyes. "You're telling me that my existing anger, expressed publicly, disrupts the defense strategy." He paused. "That's not manipulation." "No," Ragnarok said. "It is alignment. Your interests and our strategy are the same. I prefer to be transparent about that." Harry appreciated this more than he'd have been able to explain. The political landscape of his life had been built on people with aligned interests who pretended their interests were purely his welfare, and the straightforward acknowledgement that this was a partnership between parties who both had something at stake felt cleaner than almost any political conversation he'd ever been party to. "What do you know about Umbridge that isn't in the audit?" Harry asked. Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. "She has been aware of our investigation," he said. "Not the specifics, but the general existence of a Gringotts inquiry. Our best estimate is that she's known for 3 months. She's been preparing." "Yes." He paused. "She has also been having conversations with 4 members of the Wisendamat that we consider significant. We have not been able to determine the content of those conversations." "Who are they?" Ragnarok named them. Harry knew two of them, old names, old families, the kind that had been in the Wisengamot for generations and treated their seats as inherited property rather than democratic appointments. The other two were less familiar, but the family names carried the weight of old wealth and older politics. "Are they going to try to block the prosecution?" Harry asked. "They are going to try to redirect it," Ragnarok said. "Make it about the form of the declaration rather than its substance. Argue that the Goblin Nation's legal standing in a wizarding criminal proceeding is invalid under the 1752 Creature Classification Act. Because goblins are classified as creatures, not beings," Harry said. The sourness he felt at saying it was evident in his voice. "Yes." Ragnarok's voice was entirely even. "It is a classification that the wizarding world has maintained specifically to prevent us from holding the legal standing that would make moments like this one possible." Harry looked at the map table, at the marks indicating magical territories, at the centuries of goblin craft running through every underground inch of this country. "Has anyone ever formally challenged the classification?" "7 times since 1752, Ragnarok said. Each time the challenge was structured in ways that allowed the Wisengamot to reject it on procedural grounds before it reached substantive argument. "The framework motion Hermione is writing," Harry said slowly. "Does it require that goblins have being-level legal standing, or does it work around it?" "It works around it," Ragnarok said. "Which is why it has a chance of succeeding in the short term." He paused. "The long-term problem remains. Then in the long term, we fix the classification." Harry said it simply, as a statement of intention rather than an aspiration. Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment with that bronze-eyed attention. "That is not a small project." "No." Harry met his gaze. "But if we get through this prosecution and write a framework that treats goblin forensic evidence as valid in wizarding courts, we've already cracked the argument. The classification can't sustain itself once its practical implications start breaking down in court." He paused. "You know this." "I know this," Ragnarok agreed. "I wanted to know if you did." The afternoon came with a complication, as afternoons had been doing lately. Harry was back at Grimmauld Place when a Patronus arrived through the wall, silver, sleek, Kingsley's lynx, crouching briefly on the kitchen floor before it spoke in Kingsley's voice. "Umbridge has issued a public statement through Cuff. I think you need to read it before it's in the evening edition." The statement arrived by owl 10 minutes later, a copy Kingsley had sent directly. Harry read it at the kitchen table while Hermione and Neville, who'd turned up with dinner, which he'd started doing regularly enough that Harry had quietly given him a key, read it over his shoulders. The statement was elegant in the specific way that well-crafted dishonesty is elegant. Dolores Umbridge, speaking through Cuff's precise legal prose, expressed deep concern for the rule of law in Wizarding Britain, noted her decades of dedicated service to the Ministry and to the protection of the magical community, and characterized the Gringotts Declaration as a coercive action by a non-wizarding entity seeking to leverage political pressure to interfere with British wizarding judicial sovereignty. Then, in paragraph 4, it said this: "The welfare of all magical persons has always been and remains my primary concern. During my tenure in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, every action taken was authorized within the scope of my official role and reviewed by appropriate authorities. I have full confidence that a fair and impartial review process will reflect this. I would note with concern that certain individuals appear to be colluding with a foreign magical power to advance personal grievances in ways that risk destabilizing the institutions that protect all witches and wizards, regardless of their circumstances or parentage." Harry put the statement down. "Colluding with a foreign magical power," Neville read aloud. "She's calling you a collaborator." "She's calling me a collaborator with the Goblin Nation specifically," Harry said. "Which is designed to land a certain way with people who already don't like the idea of goblins having legal standing. Every action taken was authorized and reviewed," Hermione quoted. "She's pointing at Fudge's signature. She's going to argue she was following orders." "She designed the protocol," Harry said. "She wasn't following orders. She wrote them." He looked at the statement again. "This is well crafted. It's a lie, Neville said. It's a well-crafted lie, Harry said. There's a difference, and it matters. She's not just denying it, she's constructing an alternative frame that her allies can stand inside. She's giving the 4 Wizengamot members something to attach to. He paused. She's also doing something else. The parentage line, Hermione said. Yes. Harry looked at her. She's reminding everyone who she's always been and who she's always talked to. Not explicitly enough to be held to it. Just enough to signal to her base that this is the same fight it's always been. He folded the statement. She thinks she can make the public argument while her allies fight the legal one. Dual front. Can she? Neville asked. For a little while, Harry said. Until the charges land and the documentation goes public. He looked at the folded statement. The audit materials are extraordinary, Neville. Names, dates, purchase orders, healers' assessments, the lattice diagrams. When people can actually see what was done, not read a summary but look at the diagrams and see the channels narrowed over years, that's not a narrative you can maintain a counterframe against. Then we need it public, Hermione said. It'll be public when the prosecution files, Harry said. Which is, he stopped. Actually, it doesn't have to wait for the prosecution. Both Hermione and Neville looked at him. The audit is Ragnarok's document, Harry said slowly. He controls its publication. And he has already been transparent about the declaration, the full text was posted in the ministry atrium. If he publishes the supporting materials, he paused. Has he? No, Hermione said. The declaration referenced the audit but the audit itself is still internal. Harry stood. He was already thinking 2 steps ahead, feeling the shape of it, and the feeling was different than it would have been a week ago, faster, cleaner, like thinking through water that had become air. I need to talk to Ragnarok. You were just there, Hermione said. I know. He reached for his coat. This is what happens when things start moving. The streets of Diagon Alley at early evening were better lit than they'd been a year ago, people had put up lights, colored ones, strung between buildings in a way that felt defiant and celebratory simultaneously, a collective refusal to go back to the darkness. Harry walked through them quickly, the light catching in the rain-wet stones, and thought about Umbridge sitting somewhere drafting that statement, sure in her bones that the machinery she'd operated for 20 years would protect her. He thought about the diagrams in the audit. The channels, narrowed and scarred. The careful, methodical architecture of small reductions, year by year, layer by layer, designed so that he'd never feel the ceiling he was hitting because he'd never known there was a ceiling at all. He thought about her face in that awful office in his 5th year, the pink everything, the kittens, the rigid pleasant smile that she wore like a second skin over something very cold and very deliberate. He'd known then that she was dangerous. He hadn't known the half of it. He went back down through Gringotts, all the way to the working office, and Ragnarok was still there, which suggested either goblin work hours were extraordinary or he'd been expecting Harry to return. The audit materials, Harry said, before he sat down. You should publish them. Ragnarok looked at him steadily. Before the prosecution files. Before Cuff's narrative takes hold. The statement he issued today is the foundation of her defense. It works if the public is operating on general knowledge of the situation. It collapses if the public can see the actual documents. Publishing before the prosecution creates a complicated precedent, Ragnarok said. Defense counsel will argue prejudicial pre-trial. Cuff just issued a public statement on her behalf, Harry said. She's already in the court of public opinion. We're playing catch-up in a game she started. He looked at the map table. The audit is yours. You commissioned it. You own it. Publishing it doesn't breach any wizarding legal protocol, it's not a prosecution document, it's a Gringotts internal audit. The fact that it's also the evidentiary basis of a prosecution doesn't make it sub judice before the prosecution formally begins. Ragnarok was quiet for a long moment. Hermione checked this, Harry said. I'm not guessing. When did she check it? Approximately 20 minutes ago while I was walking here. He paused. She sends well-reasoned things quickly when something needs to happen. Something moved in Ragnar's expression that was as close as he came to genuine amusement. He reached to his left and pulled a sealed document from a stack, not at random, Harry noticed, with precise knowledge of where it was. He broke the seal and opened it. I had this prepared 2 days ago, Ragnar said, against the possibility that it would be needed. He looked at Harry over the paper. I was wondering when you would ask for it. Harry looked at the document in his hands. It was the full audit, formatted for public distribution, with a cover letter from the War Chief's office that had been written with evident care, factual, direct, devastating. 2 days ago, Harry said. You needed to reach the conclusion yourself, Ragnar said. If I had offered it, you would have asked all the right questions about timing and precedent and you would have talked yourself into waiting. This way, he set the original back down. You came to me. Which means you are certain. Harry looked at him. You're very patient. I am several hundred years old, Ragnar said. I have some experience with waiting for the right moment. They published the audit the next morning, simultaneous in the Wizarding Press and posted in full on the Gringotts public notice board. Every page. Every diagram. Every purchase order with Fudge's signature. The healer's annotated assessments showing the progression of suppression, year by year, from Harry's first term at Hogwarts to his 7th. The compound analysis. The dormitory ward signatures. Harry stood in front of the Gringotts notice board as the copies went up, because Ragnar had suggested, with the same quiet strategic precision that Harry was becoming fluent in reading, that being visibly present when the documents appeared would communicate something that no statement could. He wasn't performing outrage. He wasn't making a speech. He was simply standing there, in his ordinary coat, reading the documents about his own life the way anyone might read news about themselves in public. Present, composed, and entirely unbowed. A small crowd gathered within the first hour. Within 2 hours it was not a small crowd. The Prophet's afternoon edition had a single word as its headline, read. Below it, the full front page was the audit's most significant diagram. The 2 magical core images side by side. The suppressed one, labeled current. The projected natural development, labeled what should have been. The gap between them, measured and annotated and utterly, completely clear. Hermione brought it to him when she found him. She stood beside him in front of the notice board, and she looked at the diagram that had been reproduced at full size, and she was quiet for a long time. The crowd moved and murmured around them, and somewhere nearby someone was crying, which was a strange sound in the middle of a public gathering but not, Harry thought, an inappropriate one. The 3rd session is in 2 days, she said finally. I know. And after that, she paused. What does full capacity feel like? Do you have any sense of it? He thought about what he could already feel, the depth and immediacy of it, the way his magic arrived differently now, present and full and ready. He thought about the veins in the walls lighting up. He thought about what Thornfist had said about the 3rd layer, the oldest, the deepest, the one woven into his core at age 11 when everything had been new and strange and he'd had no frame for what he was losing. Ask me in 3 days, he said. She nodded. They stood in front of the documents for another minute, and then Harry stepped back and they walked away through the crowd, past people who were reading and pointing and arguing and crying, past a group of young witches who couldn't have been more than 20 and had clearly just found the line about 32% and were reacting to it with the unconstrained fury of people for whom the injustice was close to the surface, through Diagon Alley and out into the London street. The sky above them was ordinary, grey and wide and entirely indifferent to the small human drama below it. Harry tilted his head back and looked at it for a moment. He thought about Thornfist telling him he'd spent 20 years cutting new channels. He thought about how many times he'd fought and clawed and improvised his way through things that should have been available to him straightforwardly, and how every person who'd watched him do it had attributed it to talent or courage or luck, and none of them, not one, had thought to ask whether the river should have been bigger than this. It's a lot to feel, Hermione said quietly, reading him the way she always had. Yes, Harry said. Are you all right? He considered the question properly, the way it deserved. I'm better than I've ever been, he said. And simultaneously furious about everything that made that sentence possible. He looked at her. Both things are true. Both things can be true, she said. He went home and he did not sleep badly and he did not sleep easily, but he slept, and in the morning the audit was everywhere, on the wireless, in the Prophet, being discussed in hushed and heated voices in every wizarding establishment in Britain, and somewhere in a ministry that was scrambling to respond. Dolores Umbridge read it over breakfast with her second face finally visible to anyone who looked at her expression carefully. Not fear. Not yet. But something that had begun to understand that the machinery she'd operated for 20 years had just had something thrown into its gears. Chapter 4, The Architect. Umbridge's arrest happened on a Wednesday, which felt appropriate somehow, not a dramatic day, not a Monday with its sense of fresh starts or a Friday with its charged endings. Wednesday was the day the ministry did paperwork, processed routine matters, pretended the ordinary was still functioning while everything around it was on fire. Kingsley had charged her on Tuesday, as promised within the 10-day window, and she'd been formally detained Wednesday morning at 8:30, which was when Harry found out because Neville knocked on his door with the Prophet and a look that suggested he'd run part of the way. The headline was, "She's been charged." Below that, smaller, Wizengamot suspended member faces criminal prosecution under newly established joint covenant framework. Ragnarok calls it a beginning. Harry read the article standing in his doorway. Neville waited, watching his face with the focused attention of someone braced for a range of possible reactions. When Harry finished, he handed the paper back and said, "Coffee," and went inside, and Neville followed, and that was that. They sat at the kitchen table and Harry stared at the grain of the wood and felt something that wasn't satisfaction. Satisfaction would have been too clean, too complete, but something adjacent to it, the specific relief of a thing you have been waiting for finally beginning to be true. Not finished. Beginning. She walked in herself, Neville said, reading further into the article. Cuff advised her to present voluntarily. She arrived with him, 2 junior solicitors, and apparently, he squinted at the text. A comment about the rule of law that the reporter describes as measured and composed. Of course she did, Harry said. She's treating it like a political performance. It is one, Harry said. Every moment of this is a performance for her. The arrest, the arraignment, the trial, they're all stages she's decided she can manage. He picked up his coffee. She's been managing stages her whole career. Can she manage this one? Harry thought about the audit documents, which had now been read by what felt like every witch and wizard in Britain. He thought about the diagrams, reproduced and discussed and argued over in every forum available. He thought about the letters that had arrived at Grimmauld Place over the past 2 days, dozens of them, from strangers, from former classmates, from people he'd never met, with a quality in them that was different from the usual post-war correspondence. Less reverent. More personal. More angry on his behalf than he was on his own. No, he said. She can't manage this one. But she doesn't know that yet. Hermione arrived at 9 with Delia Marcus and a face that said something had developed overnight. She sat down, accepted coffee, and looked at Harry. The 4 Wizengamot members Ragnarok identified. The ones Umbridge has been talking to. What about them? They've filed a procedural challenge. Delia Marcus opened her bag and produced a document that she slid across the table. Submitted to the Wizengamot clerk's office at 6 this morning. Challenge to the Joint Covenant Framework on the grounds of the 1752 Creature Classification Act, specifically the provision that non-being entities cannot hold co-prosecutorial standing in wizarding criminal proceedings. Harry picked it up. He read it. It was 62 pages, which meant it had been in preparation for some time, at minimum 2 weeks before the charges were even filed. Which meant Umbridge had known the framework was coming and had had her allies preparing the challenge in parallel. She's been playing 3 moves ahead, he said. 4, Deville said. There's a second motion attached. Pages 47 through 62. She looked at Harry with an expression that was professionally neutral in a way that signaled what was coming. It's a cross-filing. They're not just challenging the framework. They're questioning the legal standing of any party who participated in its creation. Including Hermione? Harry asked. Including you, Hermione said quietly. Harry turned to page 47. The argument was technically sophisticated and politically deliberate, and Harry gave Cuff, because this had Cuff's fingerprints in every paragraph, the precise media management thinking of a man who'd spent 30 years shaping how stories were told, full credit for its construction. The argument was essentially this: Harry Potter, as the party on whose behalf the Gringotts audit had been conducted, had a direct personal interest in the outcome of the prosecution. His participation in drafting the Joint Covenant framework, his presence at the ministry meeting with Ragnarok, and his public statements about the audit constituted a conflict of interest that, under Section 14 of the Wiesengomot Conduct Standards, should disqualify him from any role in the evidentiary framework underpinning the case. It was, Harry noticed, worded in a way that carefully avoided being personal while being entirely personal. It didn't say Harry Potter is a troublemaker who has colluded with goblins to persecute a ministry official. It said a party with a documented personal grievance has been permitted to shape the legal architecture of the proceedings against the party they hold that grievance against. Technically correct. Strategically designed to make Harry look like someone who'd manipulated the system rather than someone who'd been systemically wronged. They're trying to remove me from the case, Harry said. They're trying to make your involvement the story, Delia said. If they can shift the public conversation from what was done to you to what you and Ragnarok have done in response, the procedural argument, the framework, the conflict of interest, they buy time, create confusion, and give Umbridge supporters something to point at. Cuff is good, Harry said. He meant it as an assessment, not a compliment. He's exceptional, Delia agreed. He knows that the public documentation makes a content-based defense almost impossible, so he's attacking the process instead. She paused. It's the right call from his perspective. It's the only viable play. How do we respond? Hermione has thoughts, Delia said, with the tone of someone who had already been presented with Hermione's thoughts at considerable length. The conflict of interest argument only works if Harry was acting as a party to the prosecution, Hermione said. He wasn't. He was present at a diplomatic meeting between the Minister for Magic and the War Chief of the Goblin Nation, which is not a prosecutorial function. His input into the framework was consultative and informal, no different from any other interested party submitting a perspective to legal drafters. She paused. And the Section 14 conduct standard they're citing applies to Wiesengomot members. Harry is not a Wiesengomot member. They'll argue the standard applies by analogy, Delia said. Arguments by analogy are the last refuge of people who don't have the actual text on their side, Hermione said, with the precise energy of someone who had been having this argument in her head since 6 in the morning. You need to file a response today, Harry said. It's already drafted, Hermione said. I need you to read it and then we need Ragnarok to countersign. Harry spent 45 minutes reading Hermione's response, which was comprehensive, well-sourced, and contained in paragraph 8 a sentence so quietly devastating in its dissection of Cuff's analogy argument that Harry looked up from the parchment and said, "Did you write this last night?" "This morning," she said. 4 to 7. "You slept for 4 hours." "I slept for 3.5, she said. The other half was thinking. Harry went to Gringotts. Ragnarok had already seen the challenge. The aide who met Harry at the side entrance said the war chief had received his copy at 6:30 and had described it, in the aide's diplomatically careful paraphrase, as expected and manageable. Harry went up to the working office, where Ragnarok was standing at the map table, not sitting, standing, with the focused energy of someone in motion while holding still, and had the challenge document on one side and what appeared to be a counter-document already drafted on the other. "They are better organized than I anticipated," Ragnarok said, by way of greeting. "Cuff has been preparing since before the charges were filed," Harry said. Hermione's response is here. He set it on the table. Ragnock read it. He read Hermione's paragraph 8 with particular attention and then set the page down and said, she should have been a goblin advocate. She'd probably take that as a compliment, Harry said. It is the highest one I give. Ragnock picked up his pen. I will countersign. But I want to add a supplementary statement from the Goblin Nation on the being classification argument. He looked at Harry. They have opened the door to that argument by citing the 1752 Act. I intend to walk through it. Now. Harry said. During a criminal prosecution. The prosecution and the classification are not separate matters. They never have been. Ragnock met his eyes with an evenness that carried the weight of something very old behind it. The reason Umbridge believed she could do what she did without consequence is the same reason the 1752 Act exists. The belief that the Goblin Nation is not sufficiently real to demand full accountability. He paused. If we do not challenge that belief now, while we have standing and public attention, we will have spent this entire conflict winning a battle while losing the condition that allows such battles to keep being necessary. Harry looked at him. You've been waiting for this moment. I have been waiting for this argument to become possible, Ragnock said precisely. It has not been possible before now. It requires a moment when the public can see clearly what the classification produces. They can see it now. He looked at the audit diagram. There was a copy pinned to the wall of the office, which Harry hadn't noticed before. What was done to you was possible because wizarding law was designed to prevent the only institution with the forensic capacity to detect it from having the standing to prosecute it. He looked back at Harry. That is not a coincidence. It is architecture. Harry sat down slowly. Architecture. He thought about Thornfist using the same word. The suppression lattice was architecture, deliberately built, stone by stone, year by year. He thought about Ragnock's maps with their magical territories. He thought about the ministry atrium with its memorial to victims that sat in a building that had spent 30 years manufacturing them. Who knew? Harry asked. About the classification being used as a shield. Who designed it that way? The 1752 Act itself was not designed as a shield for this kind of crime, Ragnock said. It was designed as a general framework of control. The specific application, ensuring goblins could not hold prosecutorial standing, was a practical consequence that wizarding legislators were aware of and did not address. He paused. However, the individuals who authorized the action against you were certainly aware that goblin evidence would face standing challenges. It was likely a factor in their confidence. Umbridge knew that even if Gringotts found out, they couldn't touch her. Until now, Ragnock said. Because you changed the political conditions. Harry looked at the pinned diagram. The two cores side by side. The gap between what he'd had and what he should have had, measured in years and potential and all the unnamed spaces where something more should have existed. My third session is tomorrow, he said. I know. Whatever happens after that, Harry paused, finding the words. I'm not a symbol. I'm not going to stand in front of the Wizengamot and be the boy who lived having an appropriately emotional moment. That's not what this is. No, Ragnock agreed. It is not. I want to testify, Harry said. Not as a victim. As a witness to a specific set of documented facts. He looked at Ragnock. And I want to be there for the classification challenge. Not as a bystander, I want standing in that argument. Personal standing. You have it, Ragnock said immediately. Under Goblin law, you have been formally received as a protected person of the Goblin Nation. That standing is real and it is recognized by the joint framework. He paused. Cuff will challenge it. Let him, Harry said. Ragnock looked at him for a long moment with those bronze measuring eyes. Then he picked up his pen and countersigned Hermione's response document. The response was filed by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, Cuff had issued a press statement calling the counter-signature an unprecedented overreach by a non-wizarding authority into the British magical judicial system, which told Harry the argument was working because it had landed in a place that made the other side louder. Ragnarok's supplementary statement on the Classification Act had been published as part of the filing and was already in the evening papers, and it was written in the kind of clear, direct, historically grounded prose that made it very difficult to dismiss, not because it was emotional, but because it was irrefutable in every specific citation and devastating in every logical connection. Harry read it properly for the first time in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place, with Neville over his shoulder reading at the same pace. "He's been wanting to write this for years," Neville said, quietly. "Probably longer," Harry said. "He's right about everything in it." "He is." Neville was quiet for a moment. Then, "Harry, when you testify, and you are going to testify, I know you, don't tell me you're not, I'm going to testify. When you do, what are you going to say?" Harry looked at the document. He thought about the answer to that question, which he'd been turning over for days, not the specific words, but the shape of what he wanted to accomplish with them, the thing he wanted the room to understand after he'd finished speaking. "The truth," he said. "All of it. From the beginning." He paused. "Not performed. Not calibrated for maximum sympathy. Just what happened, what was done, and what it cost." He looked at Neville. "And what it would have cost if Gringotts hadn't found it." Neville absorbed this. The implication being that without the goblins, nobody would ever have known, Harry said. "I would have lived my whole life at 32%, attributed it to being naturally limited, and every time I pushed against that ceiling they'd built, every person who watched would have called it remarkable that someone so average could be so brave." He heard the edge in his own voice and didn't moderate it. That is what they wanted. That exact story. The brave, limited boy. The symbol who needed managing. "God," Neville said quietly. "That's what the testimony is about," Harry said. "Not just what Umbridge did. The logic that made it possible. The logic that the Classification Act is part of. The same logic that says goblins can't have full legal standing." He looked at Neville. "It's the same argument. In the end, it's always the same argument. Some people are too powerful, too real, too capable of full personhood, and the ones who feel threatened by that build very clever structures to manage the excess." Neville was quiet for a long time after that. Then, slowly, "I was in the DA because of you. Because you were willing to teach us what the Ministry was telling you not to teach. And I always thought," he stopped. "I thought you were extraordinary. All of us did. And you were doing it at 32%. Harry looked at him. "I know. What are you going to be like after tomorrow?" Neville asked. Not with apprehension. With something that was closer to anticipation. "Thornfist says she doesn't know exactly," Harry said. "She said she's never worked with a core of my baseline classification before." He paused. "She said try not to be alarmed." "That's terrifying," Neville said cheerfully. "That's what I thought." The third session. Thornfist had arranged things differently for it. The bench of instruments was more extensive than either previous session, some of them large enough to require floor mounts, and there were 2 junior healers present who stood at the perimeter of the room with the focused attention of people whose job was to observe and record. The walls had been prepared in some way Harry couldn't fully identify, the luminescent veins ran brighter even before he sat down, as if the room had been primed. Thornfist looked at him. "The third layer is the original. The first one placed." She held the iron tuning fork and the sound it made near his chest was still not fully clean, there was still restriction, he could hear it, could feel it as a kind of pressure at the very center of things, but it was different from what it had been 2 sessions ago. Closer to the core. Older. "How long?" he asked. "Longer than the previous sessions," she said. "Perhaps 2 hours. What should I expect to feel?" She looked at him with that expression that had become familiar, the one that meant she was deciding how much to say. When this layer releases, you will feel your magic at its natural baseline for the first time since you were 11 years old. She paused. The first time you performed accidental magic as a child, do you remember what that felt like? Harry thought about it. Growing his hair back overnight. Glass dissolving around a boa constrictor at the zoo. Landing on a roof after being chased. Yes, he said. It felt like, he thought for a moment. Like doing something obvious. Yes, Thornfist said. As if the magic was the natural extension of the intention, with nothing between them. She looked at him steadily. That is what your magic should always have felt like after 11. The thing that was taken from you was not power alone. It was the directness. The immediacy. The absence of resistance between thought and action. She paused. After this session, that will return. Harry sat on the platform. Thornfist began. The first hour was the slowest he'd ever experienced. The third layer was ancient in the way the deepest parts of the building were ancient, not old in years alone but in the way things become old when they've been load-bearing, when other structures have grown around them and depend on them. Dissolving it required working around the channels that had adapted to its presence, the compensatory pathways he'd spent 20 years building. She had to free the original architecture without damaging what had grown alongside it. He sat and he breathed and he felt the slow careful unwinding, deeper and more interior than either previous session, touching something that was not quite physical and not quite emotional but was the place where physical and emotional had their common root. Around the 90-minute mark, something shifted. He felt it in the way you feel the moment a door is almost open, the specific quality of resistance just before it yields, the last resistance before the frame clears. He said nothing. He breathed. The two junior healers at the perimeter both took a small unconscious step back. Thornfist said, quietly, "Hold still." He held still. The third layer came free. The sound it made wasn't internal this time. There was an actual sound, deep, resonant, felt in the chest more than heard with the ears, a single sustained note that belonged to the frequency range of very large things. The luminescent veins in the walls blazed white. The candles went out, not because there was darkness, but because the room was lit from every surface simultaneously. The two junior healers took another step back, and Harry felt like himself. Not more than himself. Not something new or strange or alien. Himself. The full version of what he was, every channel open and running, his magic arriving with the effortless immediacy Thornfist had described, no gap between intention and availability, no resistance, no ceiling. The same way he breathed. The same way his heart beat. This is what it feels like, he thought, to be exactly what I am. The room held its blazing stillness for a long moment. Then the light normalized, not dropped away suddenly, but settled, like the surface of water after a stone has passed through it, finding its new level. The candles reignited. The veins in the walls returned to their ambient luminescence, which was, Harry noticed, brighter than it had been when he'd walked in for the first session 3 days ago. The room had permanently recalibrated. He looked at his hands. They looked exactly the same as they always had. He reached for his magic, the habitual check, and it arrived like a tide rather than a trickle, immediate, enormous, completely fluent, and he brought it in carefully, because he was in a room with people in it, and the control was there. The control was excellent. Better than it had ever been, because now there was something worth controlling. Thornfist was writing. The scratch of her pen was the only sound. "Well?" Harry asked. "I have been practicing goblin medicine for 163 years, she said, without looking up. I have performed core restoration on 47 patients. She paused. I will need to write a paper about this session. I'd prefer you didn't use my name. I will use your case reference number, she said, with the tone of someone who had already decided this. The core readings are, she paused again, the pen stopping. I need to measure again. She measured again. She measured 3 times. When she looked up at him, something in her ancient face had shifted. Not surprise, she'd told him his natural baseline was extraordinary. Not alarm. Something rarer, more considered. The suppression masked it even in our preliminary estimates, she said. We knew your baseline was high. We projected a restoration to upper-tier classification. She set her pen down. The actual baseline, now fully accessible, exceeds upper-tier classification. What classification is it? She looked at him for a long moment. There are 7 standard classifications in Goblin Core assessment, she said. The first 3 cover the large majority of the magical population. The 4th and 5th are what wizarding documentation refers to as exceptionally gifted. The 6th is what wizarding history records perhaps once per century. She paused. You are a 7th tier classification. There is no tier 8. Harry sat with this. What does that mean practically? He asked. Not with awe. Practically. It means your theoretical ceiling for magical output is effectively, she paused. It is very high, she said, which was the most careful way she'd ever spoken. It means your practical limits are primarily those of technique, focus, and endurance, rather than raw capacity. It means that with appropriate development and training, she stopped. There is no meaningful ceiling to address. The question is how you choose to use what you have. He nodded slowly. There is one more thing, Thornfist said. She set down her instruments. The 20 years of suppression and the compensatory channeling you developed in response, the new pathways you cut around the blocked ones, those do not disappear when the suppression is removed. They remain. She looked at him. You have the innate capacity of a 7th tier core and the developed compensatory creativity of someone who spent 20 years solving problems with one hand tied behind their back. Harry looked at her. You are, in technical terms, she said, with what might have been the goblin equivalent of complete understatement, quite formidable. He walked out of Gringotts into the afternoon and stood on the marble steps, and the world had turned up again, but differently this time. Not brighter or louder. Deeper. More textured. More real in the way that only things fully perceived are real. He could feel the magic in the city around him the way you feel weather, the wards on Diagon Alley shopfronts, the protections on Gringotts itself at his back like a warm wall, the distant signature of Hogwarts somewhere far to the north, and further than that, things he'd have to learn to read, signatures and patterns and the deep slow hum of very old magic in very old places. He stood on the steps and let himself feel all of it and didn't manage it back. Ragnarok came through the main doors behind him, which told Harry the war chief had been informed of the session's completion and had arranged to be there. He stood beside Harry at the top of the steps and looked out at Diagon Alley. Thornfist called ahead, Harry said. She did, Ragnarok confirmed. She told you the classification. She told me the classification. They stood in silence for a moment. 7th tier, Harry said. Yes. Is that, he paused. In Goblin history. Has it happened before? Twice that we have reliable documentation of, Ragnarok said. The second instance was approximately 800 years ago. He paused. The first was considerably earlier. What happened to those people? Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. The historical record is incomplete, he said carefully. What we know is that both individuals lived in periods when the magical world did not have the framework to understand what they were. One withdrew entirely from public life. The other, he paused. The other was killed by people who were afraid of what she was. Harry looked out at Diagon Alley. At the ordinary, imperfect, slowly healing world. I'm not going to withdraw, he said. No, Ragnarok said. I know. And I'm not interested in being something people are afraid of, Harry said. I've been that. I've been the thing in the dark that people tell themselves might save them or destroy them. I don't want that story. What story do you want? Harry thought about the answer. He thought about Neville's question, what are you going to say when you testify? He thought about standing in front of the Wisengamot with the full weight of what he was, with Ragnar's classification sitting in the record and Umbridge across the room and the 4 members who'd filed the procedural challenge in their seats and all the eyes of Wizarding Britain on him, and what he was going to say with all of that attending him. The true one, he said. The one where I'm a person, not a symbol. Where the goblins are people, not instruments. Where the institutions are held to the same standards they claim to uphold. He looked at Ragnar. The one where what was done to me actually cost someone something. Ragnar was quiet for a long moment. The bronze eyes were steady and direct, and something in them was very old and very certain. Then, he said, we should prepare. Behind them, Gringotts stood as it always had, its marble face to the world, its real depth hidden below the surface. And Harry Potter stood at the top of its steps with the full weight of himself present for the first time in his life, feeling the city around him and the magic in it and the specific, charged, important rightness of knowing exactly what he was going to do next. His scar didn't hurt. It hadn't hurt in years. But for a moment, standing there, he felt a different kind of thing in his chest, not pain, not the ghost of someone else's presence, but the clean, unfamiliar feeling of his own potential, running free and full and entirely his. He was ready. Chapter 5, The Reckoning. The Wisengamot convened on a Thursday. Not for the trial, that was still weeks away, grinding through procedural challenges and counterfilings and the slow machinery of institutional law. This was the preliminary hearing, the session where the joint covenant framework would either be confirmed as valid evidentiary architecture or dismantled by Cuff's classification challenge before the prosecution could build anything on it. If the framework fell, the Goblin audit evidence became inadmissible. If the evidence became inadmissible, the prosecution became a political argument rather than a legal one, and political arguments were exactly the terrain where people like Umbridge had spent their careers winning. Harry arrived early. The Wisengamot courtroom was underground, all the significant ones were, and it had the particular atmosphere of a space that had been making consequential decisions for centuries and was entirely aware of this. The walls were dark stone, the tiered seating arranged in a steep horseshoe, the ancient magic of the place sitting in the air like pressure. Harry had been here before, for his own hearing in 5th year, and the memory of that sat in him clearly, the cold, the deliberate intimidation of the architecture, the feeling of being very small in front of very large machinery. He sat in the witness gallery and felt none of that. Not because he was performing confidence. Because the room was what it was and he was what he was, and neither of those things had changed in a way that required him to perform anything. He watched the Wisengamot members file into their tiered seats, and he noted the ones he recognized, the 4 Ragnar had named, sitting in a cluster on the upper left, which was either coincidence or deliberate solidarity, and Harry decided it was the latter. He noted who sat near them and who sat as far from them as the seating allowed, and he read the room the way Ragnar had been teaching him to read rooms over the past 2 weeks, not with paranoia but with attention. Ragnar sat to his left. 6 members of the Goblin Nation's legal delegation sat in the formal visitor gallery on the opposite side, robed, composed, holding the specific stillness of people who had prepared exhaustively and were now waiting for the work to begin. Hermione sat to Harry's right with Delia Marcus, both of them with documents open on their laps, making small notations. Neville sat 1 row behind, which was exactly where Neville had always been, close enough to be there for whatever came, far enough not to crowd the thing. Umbridge arrived with Cuff and her team. Harry watched her come in. He hadn't seen her in person since 5th year, since the blood quill and the educational decrees and the particular sustained cruelty of someone who understood institutional power precisely because she'd spent her life acquiring small pieces of it. She was older. She looked the same. The pink was gone, she wore dark professional robes, which told Harry Cuff had briefed her on optics, but the face was entirely recognizable. Not monstrous. That was always the thing about Umbridge that made her more dangerous than monsters. She looked like a bureaucrat. She looked like someone's aunt. She looked like a person who had made reasonable decisions for reasonable reasons, and the reasonableness was load-bearing to everything she'd ever done. She sat down and looked across the room and found Harry's eyes almost immediately, with the directness of someone who had expected him to be there and had decided to see him first rather than be seen. Harry looked back at her with complete composure and no expression whatsoever. She looked away first. He noted this and filed it. Chief Warlock Griselda Marchbanks, ancient, sharp, with a long history of independence from ministry pressure that had made her the only acceptable choice for this hearing, called the session to order with the particular authority of someone who needed no theater to establish it. She stated the purpose of the hearing. She acknowledged the presence of the Goblin Nation's legal delegation, which caused a small audible shift in the room from the direction of the 4 members on the upper left. Marchbanks looked in that direction for a measured moment without expression and then looked back at the center of the room. Cuff stood. Harry had expected him to be impressive, and he was, tall, with the full, smooth voice of someone who had spent 30 years as the most powerful communicator in wizarding journalism, and a presence in a room that came from absolute certainty that he knew how to shape what a room was thinking. He laid out the challenge to the framework with clarity and precision and, Harry acknowledged, genuine intellectual force. The argument was the same as the filing, the 1752 Classification Act, the standing issue, the conflict of interest, but spoken by Cuff it had a different texture, more personal, more accessible, more designed to land in the gut of anyone in those seats who'd spent their career believing in the primacy of wizarding judicial sovereignty. He spoke for 40 minutes. When he finished, Marchbanks looked at the Goblin delegation's lead advocate, a young goblin, younger than Harry would have expected, with the absolute composure of someone who had been preparing for this specific moment for his entire professional life. His name was Stedrock, and he stood up with a document and proceeded to dismantle Cuff's argument with a thoroughness that reminded Harry of Hermione at her most comprehensive except slightly less warm. The core of Stedrock's argument was this: the 1752 Classification Act defined the limits of goblin participation in wizarding criminal proceedings as they existed in 1752. The Joint Covenant Framework, developed under joint ministerial and goblin authority in 2000, was a new legal instrument that superseded the 1752 Act in the specific matters it addressed. Under the doctrine of lex posterior, newer law supersedes older law in areas of direct conflict. The framework was valid and the 1752 Act's standing provisions were inapplicable. Cuff was on his feet the moment Stedrock finished. The doctrine of lex posterior applies only when the newer instrument explicitly addresses the conflict, page 3, paragraph 2 of the Joint Covenant Framework, Hermione said. The room went quiet. Marchbanks looked at her. Ms. Granger, you are in the witness gallery. You do not have the floor. I apologize, Chief Warlock. Hermione's voice was completely controlled. I simply wanted to note the specific reference for the record. Marchbanks looked at her for a moment that was not quite stern and not quite amused. Noted. She turned back to the room. The reference will be examined. She looked at Cuff. Mr. Cuff, continue. Cuff continued. He adapted with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to having the ground shift under him, pivoted away from the lex posterior argument and pressed on the conflict of interest motion, which was the sharper tool in any case, the one designed to land with the public rather than the legal theorists. He built it carefully, speaking directly to the 4 sympathetic Wisingamot members without appearing to, using the language of institutional integrity and judicial impartiality and the solemn obligation of the court to be seen to be above reproach. When he reached the part about Harry's role in the framework, Harry felt the room shift in the specific way rooms shift when attention consolidates, the slight change in how people held themselves, the quality of listening becoming more focused. Cuff said, the individual on whose behalf this prosecution is brought was permitted, indeed, appears to have been actively encouraged, to shape the very legal architecture by which the evidence against the accused would be assessed. This is not, he paused for effect, and the pause was excellent. This is not justice. This is a man writing the rules of the game he is playing. Harry stood up. Not because anyone had given him the floor. Not because Marchbanks had called on him. He simply stood up, in the witness gallery, with complete unhurried calm, and waited. Marchbanks looked at him. Lord Potterblack, she said, with the particular tone of someone deciding whether to be annoyed or interested. Do you wish to address the court? I'd like to respond to a specific characterization, Harry said. If the chief warlock would permit it. A pause. Cuff's expression was carefully neutral, which told Harry the move had landed in a place that wasn't entirely unwelcome for Cuff. Getting Harry speaking reactively was arguably part of the strategy, forcing him into an emotional response that could be framed as evidence of the conflict. Harry was aware of this. He spoke anyway, because the calculation only worked if he was reactive, and he wasn't. Mr. Cuff suggests I wrote the rules of the game I'm playing, Harry said, his voice entirely even. I'd like the court to understand what my role in the joint covenant framework actually was. He looked at Marchbanks, not at Cuff, not at the four members, not at Umbridge. Just at Marchbanks, who was the person in this room whose judgment actually mattered. I introduced the ministry's legal team to Hermione Granger and suggested they work together. The framework itself was drafted entirely by Ms. Granger and Delia Marcus, reviewed by the Goblin Nation's legal division, and countersigned by Ragnarok as war chief. My name appears nowhere in the document. He paused. What I did was ask that the people with the relevant expertise actually use it. He looked directly at Cuff now. If that constitutes writing the rules of the game, Mr. Cuff has a very unusual definition of authorship. A small sound from the room. Not quite laughter. Something drier. Marchbanks did not hide whatever was in her expression. Sit down, Lord Potterblack. Harry sat. Ragnarok, beside him, was looking at the front of the room and said nothing, but something in the quality of his stillness communicated satisfaction the way a held note communicates resolution. Cuff moved on. He was good enough not to push at ground he'd just lost. He pivoted back to the lex posterior argument, finding a new angle, and the hearing continued, and it was another 2 hours before Marchbanks called a recess and the room breathed. During the recess, Harry stood in the corridor outside the courtroom with a cup of water from a side table and Neville at his elbow. Across the corridor, he could see Cuff in quiet intense conversation with one of his junior solicitors, and further down, 2 of the 4 Wisengamot members talking to each other with the focused urgency of a recalculation happening in real time. The lex posterior argument is their problem, Hermione said, appearing at his side. Stedrock was right and they know it. The conflict of interest motion is a longer fight, there's enough ambiguity there that they can press it into a full subsidiary hearing, which would delay the primary proceedings by weeks, Delia Marcus said, coming around from the other side. Minimum. Can they be stopped? Harry asked. Legally. Hermione made a face. With difficulty. The standards for qualifying a conflict of interest in Wisengamot proceedings are genuinely broad. Then we don't fight it legally, Harry said. Both women looked at him. We make it publicly untenable to pursue, he said. If the 4 members who filed the challenge are seen to be actively working to delay a prosecution on behalf of someone the entire wizarding world has just watched be documented as having poisoned a specific person's magical core for 9 years, he paused. Their seats come up for renewal on a 4-year cycle. 3 of the 4 are in the 2nd year of their current term. Hermione stared at him. When did you, last week? He looked at his cup of water. Ragnarok's office pulled the renewal schedules. Delia Marcus made a short sound that might have been a laugh. You're going to make it politically impossible for them to keep going, Hermione said slowly. They have the legal standing to file every motion they want, Harry said. What they don't have is the ability to make their constituents comfortable watching them do it. He looked at her. Write something. Not legal. Plain language. What the conflict of interest motion actually does, what it delays and why it matters. Put it where people can read it. A public statement from you. From you, he said. Your name is cleaner on this. You're not the injured party. He paused. Although, he thought for a moment. Get Kingsley to respond publicly to the motion as well. He committed to 10 days. The delay tactics are working against his own stated timeline. He'll say something. He might say something regardless, Hermione said. Make sure he does, Harry said. She nodded and moved off with Delia Marcus already talking in low rapid tones. Neville watched them go. You know, Neville said, at school you were terrible at strategy. I was working at 32%, Harry said. Neville laughed, which was genuine and therefore the best sound in the corridor. They went back in. The afternoon session moved differently than the morning. Marchbanks had clearly done some thinking during the recess, because she handled the conflict of interest motion with a precision that told Harry she'd identified the delay tactic for what it was and had decided not to give it the room it was asking for. She acknowledged the motion, noted that it raised points of legitimate procedural concern, and then announced that it would be addressed through a written submission process with a deadline of 5 days, not a full subsidiary hearing, not weeks of delay, 5 days for written arguments on both sides, after which she would rule. Cuff's professional mask held, but only just. The 4 members on the upper left exchanged looks. The session ended at 4:30 with the joint covenant framework still standing, the conflict of interest motion confined to a tight timeline, and Marchbanks' ruling on lex posterior, which came at the very end, stated briefly and without ceremony, confirming that the framework superseded the 1752 Classification Act in a specific matter of forensic evidence certification. The framework was valid. The prosecution could proceed. Harry walked out of the Wisengamot building into a late afternoon that was cold and grey and felt, nonetheless, like a particular kind of day. Ragnarok walked beside him. Behind them, Hermione and Delia Marcus were already in motion, planning, calling, the 5-day submission window already being turned into a working timeline. Further behind, Neville was on his broom, which he'd left around the corner, because Neville was someone who processed things by moving. The framework stands, Harry said. Yes, Ragnarok said. Cuff will use the 5 days well. He will write the best submission he can write, Ragnarok agreed. It will not be enough. He paused, and the pause had the quality of something else in it. You stood up in there without being called. I was responding to a specific misrepresentation, Harry said. You were. Ragnarok glanced at him sideways. Marchbanks appreciated it. She does not appreciate performance, but she respected that it was not one. He paused again. You have been spending time with my maps. The renewal schedules, Harry said. Yes. I should have asked first. You were welcome to them, Ragnarok said. I left them accessible. A beat. Deliberately. Harry looked at him. You wanted me to find the renewal schedules. I wanted you to be thinking on multiple fronts, Ragnarok said simply. The legal argument is one front. The political conditions that allow the legal argument to be sustained are another. He looked ahead, at the grey London street they were walking into. You found the second front yourself. Good. Harry looked at him for a long moment. You're teaching me something. I am showing you things, Ragnarok said. What you do with them is your own. The public statement from Hermione went out the following morning, co-signed by Delia Marcus and distributed to every significant wizarding publication. It was 22 paragraphs long, written in the plainest language she was capable of, which was still more precise than most people's most careful writing, and it explained exactly what the conflict of interest motion would achieve if successful, which was to make the forensic documentation gathered over 8 months of Goblin investigation inadmissible in criminal proceedings against the woman it documented. It ended with a sentence that Harry hadn't suggested but recognized immediately as Hermione at her sharpest: the only reason to make evidence inadmissible is because the evidence is true. Kingsley's public response came by noon. It was measured, ministerial, and completely clear. The Ministry of Magic had committed to accountability and would not accept procedural tactics designed to undermine the evidentiary foundation of a valid prosecution. It named the 5-day timeline and said the Ministry's own submission would support the framework standing. The 4 Wisengamot members who had filed the motion were publicly named in the resulting coverage, as they had to be. They'd filed it publicly, they were public officials, and the coverage was not kind. On the 3rd day of the 5-day window, one of the 4 withdrew from the motion. On the 4th day, a second withdrew. On the 5th day, Cuff filed the written argument, which was excellent, and Stedrock filed the counter-argument, which was comprehensive, and Marchbanks ruled the following morning that the conflict of interest motion was dismissed on the grounds that it did not meet the standard of demonstrated prejudice required under the Wiesengemot's own 1987 procedural guidelines. The prosecution was fully cleared to proceed. Harry was at Grimmauld Place when the ruling came through, by Patronus from Kingsley, Silver Lynx crouching on the kitchen floor again, this time saying simply, "It's clear. We're moving forward." He was making toast. He finished making it. He ate it. Hermione arrived 20 minutes later with Neville and Ron brought butterbeer because Ron always brought butterbeer when something needed marking, and they sat in the kitchen and drank it and talked about what came next, and at some point Harry looked around the table, these three people who had been beside him through the worst version of everything, and felt something settle in him that was clean and complete. "There'll be a formal hearing next," Hermione said. "After the pre-trial motions. Umbridge will testify. Her team will try everything they haven't been able to try in the preliminary stage." She wrapped her hands around her butterbeer. "It's going to be difficult. It's going to be public," Harry said. "Everything that was done. Every document. On record, in open proceedings, permanent." He looked at the table. "That's what I wanted." "She could still get off," Ron said, with the directness that was one of his best qualities. "The wizarding justice system has let people off before when it shouldn't have." "She could," Harry agreed. "But she can't make the audit go away. She can't make the documents go away. Even if she walks out of a Wiesengemot hearing free, the record exists. What she did is documented and public and permanent." He paused. "That was always the most important thing. Not the punishment, the record." Ron looked at him. "When did you get so, I don't know the word. Measured?" Neville suggested. "Focused," Ron said. "You used to," he stopped. "You used to go headfirst into everything. Which worked, obviously. But this is different." "I'm not suppressed anymore," Harry said simply. Ron thought about this. "So when you went headfirst into everything before, I was doing it at 32%. Harry looked at him. "Headfirst was the only gear I had." He picked up his butterbeer. "Now I have other gears. They stayed late." Neville told a story about a herbology student who had accidentally created a plant that sang, and Ron described the last cannon's match with the kind of affectionate despair that constituted genuine loyalty, and Hermione corrected someone's stated fact 3 times and apologized for none of them, and Harry sat in the middle of it and felt the warmth of it the way you feel a fire when you've been cold for a long time, completely, without reservation. The next morning, he went back to Gringotts. Not for a healing session, those were done. He went because Ragnarok had sent him a short note, "Come. There is something you should see." The aide took him down to the working office, and Ragnarok was at the map table with a new map spread over the old ones, this one not geographical but relational, a web of lines connecting names and institutions and dates. Harry looked at it and recognized some of the connections and didn't recognize others, and felt the focused pull of wanting to understand all of it. "The Umbridge prosecution is secured," Ragnarok said, without preamble. "Yes. What I want to show you is what it connects to." He indicated the map. Umbridge did not act alone, and she did not act without a system that made her confident she could act without consequence. He traced a line from her name outward. The 4 Wiesengemot members who filed the challenge. Their family names appear in ministry procurement records in connection with 3 other contracts during the same period. Harry looked at the line, then at where it went. "What are these contracts?" he asked. 2 are innocuous, standard ministry supply agreements. Ragnarok's finger stopped on the 3rd. "This one is not." He looked at Harry. "This contract is for the production and supply of the dormitory ward anchors used in the Hogwarts interference. The family that holds this contract is," he paused. "Was represented, during the period in question, by a company registered under a shell name that dissolves to a holding structure controlled by one of the 4 Waisengamot members. Harry looked at the map. They weren't just protecting her, he said. No. They were protecting themselves. Yes. Ragnarok met his eyes. The conflict of interest motion was not strategic advocacy for an ally. It was self-preservation. He paused. Which means the evidence trail does not end with Umbridge. Harry looked at the web of lines on the map. He thought about what he'd said to Neville, about the logic that made Umbridge's actions possible, about the architecture of belief and law and institutional design that allowed it. He'd been talking about it as a systemic thing, an impersonal structure. Now he was looking at specific names connected by specific lines, and the systemic thing had faces. How solid is this? He asked. Solid enough to take to Kingsley, Ragnarok said. Not solid enough yet for formal charges. But, he looked at the map. We have been building for 8 months. This is not the end of what we have found. It is the end of what we have confirmed. Harry straightened. He looked at the map for another moment, tracing the lines, feeling the shape of the thing. There are going to be more names. Yes. People who knew. People who enabled it. Yes. And the classification, Harry said. The 1752 Act. The architecture that made it possible to do this to me and be confident it would stay buried. Yes, Ragnarok said, for the 3rd time, and in that single word was the acknowledgement that they were not talking about one hearing anymore or one prosecution but something longer and more fundamental. Harry looked at the map. He looked at the names connected by lines in Ragnarok's precise script, the dates, the contracts, the web of small decisions that had accumulated into something enormous. Send everything you have to Kingsley, he said. Today. He looked at Ragnarok. And then we need to talk about what comes next. Not the prosecution, what comes after it. What this actually changes. Ragnarok looked at him. The compact, he said. Harry blinked. What compact? The governing relationship between the Goblin Nation and Wizarding Britain has been structured by a series of covenants, the oldest of which date to 1382. Ragnarok folded his hands on the table. They have been modified, extended, and eroded over 6 centuries. The 1752 Classification Act was the most significant erosion. The Joint Covenant Framework is the first expansion of Goblin legal standing in 250 years. He paused. What I want, what the Goblin Nation wants, is a new compact. Not a modification of the old structure. A new one. He looked at Harry. One that treats the Goblin Nation as what it is. A sovereign people, Harry said. Yes. Harry looked at the map. He thought about Thornfist, 300 years old, practicing medicine in a room underground, her expertise officially classified as the work of a creature rather than a being. He thought about Ragnarok's maps and his ledgers and his long, patient, exhaustive understanding of the world above the surface and the institutions that ran it. He thought about 6 centuries of goblin craft in the stone under his feet. That's not a small project, he said, deliberately echoing what Ragnarok had said to him. Ragnarok looked at him with something that might have been the start of a smile. No, he said. It is not. Then we'd better start, Harry said. The map spread between them on the table, its lines and names and connections dense with implication, and outside the city went about its business entirely unaware that in a room underground, the 2 people most responsible for what was coming were agreeing that what was coming needed to be something the world hadn't seen before. Harry felt the weight of his own magic, full and ready, the way you feel the ground under your feet. He felt very precisely ready. Chapter 6, The War That Wasn't the Assassination Attempt happened on a Monday. Harry had been walking back from the ministry, a routine briefing with Kingsley about the prosecution's opening timeline, nothing dramatic, the administrative work of justice that occupied the space between the courtroom moments. It was mid-morning, the kind of London day that couldn't decide between rain and overcast and had settled on both simultaneously, and he was thinking about the new compact, about the language Ragnock had been drafting, about whether the Wisengamot's procedural rules would require a full session vote or whether ministerial authority was sufficient to ratify. The curse came from an alley off Charing Cross Road. It was a good shot. Not a killing curse, that would have been too obvious, too clearly criminal, the kind of thing that left no ambiguity about intent and produced exactly the kind of public outrage that whoever had sent it was trying to avoid. It was something more subtle. A cutting hex layered with a compulsion component, the kind of two-part casting that required real skill, designed to slice through the victim's magical defenses and then redirect their own magic against them. On someone running at standard suppressed capacity it would have been devastating. On someone at 60 or 70% it would have been seriously damaging. On Harry at full, unrestricted, 7th tier capacity, it hit his passive ambient field and came apart like water hitting a stone wall. He felt it, not painfully, but clearly, the way you feel a gust of wind. A pressure, a dissolution, the specific sensation of something being pushed against his field and finding it had nowhere to go. He turned toward the alley without hurrying. The figure there was already moving, good instincts, running before Harry had even turned, which suggested this was a professional rather than someone acting on impulse. Harry tracked the magical signature, which was still warm and readable in the air the way a footprint stays in wet sand, and followed it around the corner and into the alley and out the other side into a narrow service passage, and there was the figure, 20 feet ahead, running hard. Harry didn't run. He reached out with his magic the way you'd extend a hand, not violently, not with force, just with presence, and it was enough. The running figure stumbled as if the air had thickened around them, not trapped but impeded, and turned, and Harry saw a man he didn't recognize, 40-odd years old, nondescript face, professional robes with no identifying marks. "Don't," Harry said, because the man's hand was going for his wand. The man's hand stopped. Not because Harry had done anything specifically. Because there was a quality to the word as Harry said it, the complete absence of threat or performance, the flat certainty of someone who genuinely didn't need to threaten, that communicated something very directly. The man's hand moved away from his wand slowly. "Who sent you?" Harry asked. The man said nothing. Harry walked toward him, unhurried, and the man took a step back, then stopped, because there was a wall. Harry stopped 3 feet away and looked at him, looked at the quality of the robes, the specific cut that said minor ministry official or contracted work, the shoes that were expensive in a way that didn't match the rest of the outfit, suggesting someone who dressed down for this. "You're not going to tell me," Harry said. "That's fine." He held the man's gaze. "I'm going to ask you something else instead. When you take this back to whoever sent you, and you will, because that's what professionals do after a failed job, tell them what happened. Exactly what happened. Not a version of it. The actual thing." The man stared at him. "The curse dissolved," Harry said. "Before it reached me. You need them to understand that." He paused. "Because whoever sent you made their decision about what I am based on information that was 8 months out of date minimum and probably 20 years out of date." He stepped back. "Tell them that." He stepped aside and let the man leave. He watched him go and then stood in the service passage for a moment, in the light rain, and thought about what this meant. Not the attempt itself, that had been clumsy in the way that desperate things are clumsy, an improvised action from someone who had run out of better options. The meaning was in the timing. The prosecution was 3 weeks from opening. The conflict of interest motion had failed. The framework was standing. The additional names from Ragnock's map were in Kingsley's hands and generating their own subsidiary investigation. Someone was afraid enough to move. He went to see Kingsley. The minister's office had a different energy than it had 2 weeks ago, more staffed, more urgent, the administrative machinery of a crisis response visible in the density of movement and the quality of concentration in every person Harry passed. Kingsley was at his desk with Abernathy and 2 Aurors Harry recognized from the order days, and he looked at Harry's expression when he came in and said, immediately, "What happened?" Harry told him. Kingsley listened with the complete, focused attention of a former senior Auror, asked 3 specific questions about the magical signature and the casting technique, and then looked at Abernathy. Log it. Full incident report. I want the signature analysis done by this afternoon. I have a partial trace, Harry said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of parchment on which he'd written down the signature characteristics before leaving the service passage, while they were still clear. He handed it to one of the Aurors. The Auror looked at the parchment, then at Harry. You notated the signature at the scene. Force of habit, Harry said. You never trained as an Auror, the Auror said. No, Harry agreed. The Auror looked at the notation again with an expression that suggested several things were being recalibrated. Whoever this was, Kingsley said, leaning back in his chair, they acted outside the scope of the legal strategy. Cuff wouldn't sanction this. The remaining Wizengamot challengers wouldn't risk this kind of exposure. He paused. This is someone who has more to lose than the people we've already identified. The additional names, Harry said. Yes. Kingsley looked at him. We've been moving carefully on the subsidiary investigation. Perhaps too carefully. He paused. Harry, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. After what happened this morning, are you going to change how you move through the world? Security detail, wards, anything. Harry considered this with genuine honesty. No, he said. Because changing how I move tells them the attempt had an effect. And it didn't. He met Kingsley's eyes. I'm not being reckless. I'm being accurate about the threat level relative to my current situation. Kingsley looked at him for a long moment. I'm going to offer you Auror support anyway. I know, Harry said. I won't take it. But I appreciate the offer. He stood. Move faster on the subsidiary investigation. Whatever's in those additional names is generating this kind of fear. That's important information. He went to Ragnarok. The war chief received the news of the assassination attempt with the stillness of someone for whom this development had been anticipated and filed under expected contingencies rather than emergencies. He asked the same 3 questions Kingsley had asked, in the same order, which told Harry the questions were the right ones. The signature, Ragnarok said, looking at Harry's notation. I know this family of casting. Whose is it? Not a person. A school. He looked at Harry. There is a private magical academy in northern Scotland, not Hogwarts, much smaller, much less known, called Casteven. It has operated for approximately 140 years. Its primary function, historically, is the training of ministry-contracted specialists. Contracted for what? Various ministry functions. Ragnarok paused. Including some that do not appear in public records. Harry sat with this. Casteven trained ministry assets. Among other things. Ragnarok set the notation down. The casting technique you described, the layered hex with compulsion component, is Casteven methodology. Their graduates have a recognizable signature approach. He looked at Harry. This is not useful for criminal prosecution. It is useful for understanding who has operational capacity and is choosing to use it. Someone with access to Casteven graduates, Harry said. Which means someone with either ministry connections or significant private resources. Both, Ragnarok said. The two are not separate categories in the relevant networks. He pulled a different map from the table's lower shelf. Harry was becoming familiar with the organizational system, which was geographical on top, relational in the middle, operational at the bottom. This one was operational. We have been watching 3 networks that connect ministry procurement, private funding, and specialist training. After this morning, I want you to see the full picture. They spent 2 hours on the maps. Harry had been good at chess. He'd been good at Quidditch, which was 3-dimensional pattern recognition under pressure. He'd been good, in the improvised desperate way of someone who had to be, at tactical decisions in the field. But this was different, this was strategic thinking at a scale and with a depth of information that he hadn't had access to before, and he found that his fully restored mind engaged with it not like someone learning something new but like someone finally using a tool they'd always had but never been given the proper grip for. He saw the networks on the maps and he saw the connections and he saw the gaps where information was missing and he asked the right questions about the gaps, and Ragnarok answered them with the precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly these questions. By the time they finished, Harry had a picture of what they were dealing with that was considerably larger and more coherent than the one he'd had that morning. "This is not about umbrage," he said. "No," Ragnarok agreed. "Umbrage is the front edge of something older." "How much older?" "The active network, the procurement contracts, the Kesteven connections, the financial structures, dates to the early 80s. Ragnarok looked at him. "Before Voldemort's first fall." Harry absorbed this carefully. "These people have been running this network through 2 wizarding wars." "Yes." Ragnarok paused. "They are not Death Eaters and they are not anti-Death Eaters. They are something more pragmatic." He looked at the map. "They are people who understood that both sides of the war represented instability, and instability is bad for the specific kind of power they hold. Their goal has never been ideological. It has been structural. Maintaining control of the systems through which Wizarding Britain is governed, regardless of who ostensibly governs it." Harry thought about Fudge, who'd been weak and political and easily managed. He thought about Scrimgeour, who'd been harder but had still been working within a system he hadn't understood the full architecture of. He thought about Thickness, who'd been a puppet. And he thought about Kingsley, who was genuinely trying to dismantle something that was considerably more extensive than anyone had told him. "Kingsley doesn't know the full scale," Harry said. "No. He needs to." "Yes," Ragnarok said. "But carefully. The people in this network are not all exposed. Some of them are still operational within the Ministry. If Kingsley moves broadly and quickly, they become aware and they move." He looked at Harry. "This requires surgical action. Specific targets, in the right sequence, before the network can adapt. The prosecution of umbrage is the public action," Harry said slowly. "It creates noise. While everyone is watching that, we address the network," Ragnarok said. "Quietly. Specifically. Before the trial ends and the noise dies and the network has time to reconfigure." He met Harry's eyes. "This is why I asked you to come this morning. Not just because of what happened in the alley." Harry looked at him. "You knew about the attempt before I came to you." "I had been informed that something was being planned," Ragnarok said. "I did not know the specifics of when or how. I was not concerned for your safety." He paused, and in the pause was the acknowledgement of exactly what that meant, the confidence, the assessment, the weight of what Thornfist had measured in the healing room. "I was concerned that it would happen before you understood the full picture. Because if I acted on it without the full picture, you would have aimed at the wrong target," Ragnarok said. "The man in the alley is not the target. He is a symptom." Harry looked at the maps. He looked at the names in Ragnarok's precise script, the lines between them, the dates and amounts and connections that added up to something that had been quietly running in the background of Wizarding Britain for 40 years. "Who's at the center?" he asked. Ragnarok pointed to a name. Harry read it. He knew the name. He knew the family. Everyone in Wizarding Britain knew the name, the same way they knew the names of old mountains, features of the landscape that had been there so long they'd stopped being noticed. "You're certain?" Harry said. "We have been building this case for 8 months, Ragnarok said. We began with your audit. We followed the procurement contracts. We followed the funding. We followed the Kesteven connections." He looked at the name on the map. "We are certain." Harry looked at the name for a long moment. "Does Kingsley have this?" "Not yet. He needs it before he hears it from anyone else." Harry stood. "Today." "Agreed." Ragnarok began rolling the operational map carefully. I will prepare a summary document. He paused. There is one more thing you should know. The attempt this morning was not authorized by the central network. It was an independent action by someone at the edge of it, someone panicking, acting without coordination. Which means the network is starting to fracture, Harry said. Under pressure, yes. Ragnarok looked at him. When networks fracture, they become dangerous in different ways. Coordinated action becomes unpredictable individual action. People who are following institutional protocols start making personal decisions. He paused. Watch your friends. Harry looked at him sharply. Not a specific threat, Ragnarok said. A general pattern. When pressure increases on a network of this kind, the people at the edges look for leverage. You are most effectively pressured through the people you care about. He met Harry's eyes without flinching from what he was saying. Take appropriate measures without making them visible. Harry nodded once, tight and clear. I will. He went back to Grimmauld Place and he didn't tell Hermione about the attempt immediately. He told her about the maps, about the networks, about the name Ragnarok had pointed to, and he watched her go through the same sequence he had: recognition, recalibration, the structural shift of a major assumption being revised. That family, she said quietly. Yes. They've been, Harry, they were at the ministry during Voldemort's occupation. They were still there after. They were there during Fudge, during Scrimgeour, structural power, Harry said. Not ideological. They don't care who's in charge as long as they can manage them. He looked at her. Fudge was manageable. Scrimgeour was harder but still inside the system. Thickness was a puppet. And then Kingsley. Kingsley is the first minister in a very long time who is actually trying to change the system rather than operate within it. Which makes him dangerous to them. Yes. And you, she said. I've always been dangerous to them, Harry said. That's why they spent 9 years trying to make me less. Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up with the particular expression that meant she'd been 2 steps ahead and had been waiting to see when he'd arrive. You're going to do something. Several things, he said. In the right sequence. Tell me. He told her. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Hermione and therefore meaningful. She interrupted when she disagreed, and she was listening to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The timing is delicate, she said. If Kingsley moves on the network names before the prosecution is far enough along to be self-sustaining, there's a risk the 2 actions contaminate each other legally. She paused. But if the network has enough time to reconfigure, they'll rebuild the defense architecture around Umbridge and we lose the evidentiary chain, Harry said. I know. He looked at her. That's why the prosecution needs to open this week. Not in 3 weeks. This week. Kingsley said 3 weeks before we knew about the network and before someone tried to kill me this morning, Harry said. Hermione stared at him. Someone tried to kill you this morning, she said, with the very flat, very controlled voice of someone experiencing something very large. Tried, Harry said. The curse dissolved. It dissolved. Against my passive field. He looked at her steadily. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't close to being hurt. I want you to know that because it's true, not to minimize it. He paused. But it changes the timeline. Whoever did it was panicking, acting outside the network's coordination. Which means the network knows the walls are closing and is starting to lose cohesion. We have a window. Hermione pressed her hands flat on the table. She breathed. She did the thing she'd always done, which was take the emotional response and put it somewhere accessible but not in the driver's seat, and bring the analytical engine fully online. How do we move the opening? She asked. Kingsley can expedite under the emergency provisions of the Wisengamot Charter, Harry said. Section 9, when evidence of ongoing criminal threat to named individuals in an active prosecution is established, the presiding chief warlock can authorize immediate opening. He paused. We have the attempted assassination. We have the signature analysis. We have the Kesteven connection. That's sufficient for Section 9. That's very good, she said quietly. Who found Section 9? Delia Marcus found it 3 weeks ago and mentioned it to me as a hypothetical, Harry said. I've been thinking about it since. Hermione looked at him. You've been thinking about this for 3 weeks. I've been thinking about contingencies, he said. Things that might become necessary. He met her eyes. I spent 20 years going headfirst because I didn't have time to think. I have time now. She nodded slowly. Delia needs to file the Section 9 application. Immediately. She was already reaching for parchment. And Kingsley needs to receive Ragnarok's summary document before the end of the day. I'll take it to him myself, Harry said. And the network names? When does that go to him? At the same meeting. Harry stood. All of it at once. I want him to see the whole picture together, not piece by piece. Piece by piece lets him rationalize each piece separately. The whole picture requires a different response, Hermione said. Yes. She was already writing. Harry went upstairs and sent patronuses to Neville and Ron, not alarming, not dramatic, just come to Grimmauld tonight, there are things you need to know, and then he sat on the edge of his bed for a moment and did the thing he rarely let himself do, which was feel all of it at the same time without managing any of it. The attempted assassination. The network maps. The name Ragnarok had pointed to. The fracturing. The window. The weight of all the moving pieces and the specific, focused knowledge that they were in the part of this where the machinery needed to move faster than the opposition could adapt. He felt his magic, full and present and ready, and he felt something else underneath it, not fear, not even close to fear, but the heightened clarity of someone who understood exactly what was at stake and had no intention of letting it go sideways. He had one shot at getting the sequence right. He stood up and went back downstairs. The meeting with Kingsley was that afternoon. Harry brought Ragnarok's summary document, the operational map rolled under his arm, and the incident report from the morning's attempt that Kingsley's own Aurors had already filed. He laid all of it on Kingsley's desk, and Kingsley read it in the specific order Harry presented it, network summary first, then operational map, then the name, then the incident report with its Kesteven signature analysis. When Kingsley finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, which was the most unguarded Harry had ever seen him. How long has Ragnarok had this? Kingsley asked. The full picture. 2 weeks, approximately. Harry paused. He was waiting until he was certain. And until he judged I was ready to have the full conversation. Kingsley looked at him. He was waiting on you. He was waiting for me to ask the right questions. Harry met his eyes. Kingsley, I need you to open the prosecution this week. Section 9. The assassination attempt gives you the grounds. The prosecution team isn't ready for, they've been ready for 3 weeks, Harry said. The team is ready. The evidentiary framework is standing. The only thing that's been delaying the opening is the standard procedural timeline, and Section 9 overrides that. He paused. If we give the network 2 more weeks to reorganize around Umbridge's defense, we lose the evidentiary chain that connects her to the broader network. Right now that chain is intact and they don't know how much of it we have. We need to move before they find out. Kingsley was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't indecision but synthesis, everything arriving at once, being weighted and ordered and resolved. The name on that map, Kingsley said. Yes. If I move on the network and it's wrong, it's not wrong, Harry said. 8 months of Goblin forensic accounting. The same methodology that identified the Hogwarts poisoning, that the Wizengamot has just confirmed is valid evidence. He held Kingsley's gaze. It's not wrong. Another long pause. I'll need to brief the prosecution team tonight, Kingsley said. Yes. Section 9 application goes to Marchbanks tomorrow morning. Yes. And the network investigation, he paused. That runs parallel, not sequential. Separate team, separate lead, insulated from the Umbridge prosecution. Yes, Harry said. That's right. Kingsley looked at him. You've been planning this sequence for how long? Most of the pieces were obvious once I had the full picture, Harry said. The sequence took about an hour. Kingsley stared at him for a moment with the expression that had become familiar, the recalibration, the reassessment, the adjusting of a mental model that hadn't quite kept pace with who Harry was now. Harry, he said. I'm glad you're on this side of the table. So am I, Harry said. The Section 9 application went to Marchbanks at 8 the following morning. She granted it by noon. The prosecution of Dolores Jane Umbridge opened the following Thursday, not 3 weeks from the preliminary hearing but 1 week from it, and the opening was covered by every wizarding publication in Britain and several abroad, and the courtroom was at full capacity, and every seat in the witness gallery was occupied by people who had been waiting for this with the specific exhausted hope of those who had stopped being surprised by their government's worst behavior but had not stopped believing it should be otherwise. Harry sat in his place in the witness gallery beside Ragnarok. He watched Umbridge come in with Cuff and take her seat, and she had the composed, measured bearing of someone performing certainty, and Harry looked at her and saw the performance clearly and saw what was underneath it and felt no satisfaction from seeing it, just the clean steady readiness of someone exactly where they were supposed to be. The prosecution team rose. The chief warlock called the court to order. And then, for the first time in all the months of build-up and documents and hearings and motions, the actual thing began, the speaking aloud of what had been done, the public, permanent, irrevocable naming of it, in a room full of people who were going to carry it with them after they left. Harry sat and listened and felt the full weight of his own presence, his own magic, his own completely unreduced and unrestricted self, and thought, this is why it matters that I'm here. Not the boy who lived. Not the symbol. Just Harry, at full capacity, refusing to be anywhere else. The prosecution read the first charge. Ragnarok, beside him, was perfectly still. Harry looked straight ahead. Outside, London carried on, and the wizarding world that sat invisible inside it held its breath, and in the streets people were reading the news on scraps of parchment or listening to the wireless or gathering in the back rooms of pubs and talking about what was happening in the building underground. The reckoning that had started with an audit and a letter and a room full of goblins who had decided that some things could not be left as they were. The prosecution continued. It was only the beginning.